Hey there, welcome to Brad Arrows. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. If these stories give you chills, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get cozy and let the fear take over. This unsettling encounter takes place in a very remote wooded area in northern Sweden, where the forests stretch endlessly in all directions and civilization feels like something from another world. At the time, I was about 15 years old, caught in that awkward stage between childhood and adulthood, where everything feels both exciting and terrifying. My extended family and I were staying in our traditional summer cabin, a rustic wooden structure that had been in our family for 3 generations. The cabin is positioned on a gentle hill overlooking a pristine lake, and at the bottom of this hill, there's a smaller cabin with a wooden dock and 2 well-maintained fishing boats. Our property is completely surrounded by dense boreal forest, consisting mainly of towering pine, spruce, and birch trees. The isolation is both beautiful and slightly unnerving, especially when you realize that the only thing visible from any window is the sloping hill leading down to the crystal clear lake, and our boats bobbing gently at the dock. It was maybe 9 o'clock in the evening, though in the Swedish summer the sun was still hanging relatively high in the sky, casting long golden shadows through the forest. The light at that time of day has a magical quality, filtering through the canopy and creating an almost dreamlike atmosphere. My father, my younger sister Emma, my 3 cousins Lars, Astrid, and Eric, along with their father, Uncle Magnus, and myself, all decided to light a campfire down by the lake shore. My grandparents, my aunt, and my mother decided not to join us because it was getting late by their standards, and they preferred to stay up at the main cabin, perhaps enjoying some tea and quiet conversation on the covered porch. We just wanted to sit by the water, do some stargazing despite the lingering twilight, and have some peaceful family conversation away from the adults. We brought both our grandparents' old German Shepherd, Gunnar, and our cousin's energetic border collie, Saga, both excellent dogs who were always eager for outdoor adventures. We walked down the winding path to the lake, gathered some dry wood from the forest edge, and lit a comfortable fire in the established stone ring that had been used by our family for decades. We spent the first hour or so just talking about life, school, our plans for the rest of the summer, and various family gossip that teenagers always find fascinating. After about an hour, our conversation had naturally fizzled out, but it was a comfortable, peaceful silence. We were all just enjoying the crackling of the fire, the gentle lapping of water against the dock, and the incredibly serene atmosphere of being surrounded by untouched wilderness. Suddenly, I started feeling distinctly uncomfortable, and I couldn't shake the growing sensation that we were being watched from the dense forest behind us. We had positioned ourselves sitting with our backs facing the woods, looking out toward the cabin on the hill and the lake beyond. But the feeling of unseen eyes observing us from the tree line was becoming increasingly unsettling and impossible to ignore. I tried to focus on other things, to convince myself it was just my imagination or natural teenage paranoia. But the feeling kept growing stronger and more persistent. Then, completely out of nowhere, my father just said clearly, "Yes, "I'm doing quite well, thank you." Everyone immediately turned to look at my father in complete confusion, since there had been no conversation taking place. We'd all been sitting in comfortable silence, just watching the fire and enjoying the peaceful evening. My father looked back toward the main cabin on the hill, then at my cousin Eric, who was sitting directly next to him, and said with a slightly puzzled expression, "Yeah, I'm doing good. Thanks for asking." "What are you talking about?" Eric responded, clearly confused. "I didn't ask you anything." My father looked genuinely bewildered and said, "I didn't ask you anything," Eric replied firmly. My father's expression grew more confused and slightly concerned as he explained what had just happened. He described feeling someone lean over close behind him and whisper directly in his ear, "Hello there, how are you doing this evening?" He said he could actually feel whatever it was breathing gently on his neck, and could sense a hand being placed lightly on his shoulder in a friendly, conversational gesture. The touch felt real and warm, like a human hand. He had initially assumed it was my mother coming down from the main cabin to check on us, and he turned around expecting to see her familiar face. But when he looked, there was absolutely nothing there. No person, no movement, nothing but the dense forest and gathering shadows. Right after my father finished explaining this bizarre experience, both dogs that were with us, Gunnar and Saga, started growling loudly and intensely. But they weren't looking at us or at each other. They were both staring directly behind where my father had been sitting, toward the dark forest, their hackles raised and their bodies tense with alert concern. We all immediately freaked out, and without any discussion or hesitation, we quickly put out the fire by dousing it with lake water and started running as fast as we could toward the main cabin up the hill. We didn't stop running until we were safely inside with the door locked behind us. Ever since that strange encounter, our family has made it an unbreakable rule that we don't venture outside the main cabin once darkness begins to fall. It's a memory that I'll never forget, not just because of how unexplainable and eerie it was, but also because of how polite and friendly the entity seemed to be. Whatever approached my father that evening was courteous enough to ask how he was doing, which suggests it wasn't malevolent or threatening. It seemed genuinely curious about his well-being, almost like a neighbor stopping by for a friendly chat. I've done some research into Swedish folklore and mythology since then, trying to understand what we might have encountered. The only thing I can think of that comes close is a vet, which is a type of Swedish nature spirit known for playing tricks on humans. According to traditional stories, vet can sometimes interact with people in seemingly friendly ways, though they're also capable of more serious mischief. Some legends say they can burn down buildings or even capture people if they feel they're being bothered or disrespected. But they're not typically known for being polite or asking after someone's health, which makes our experience even more puzzling. Other people I've told this story to have suggested it might have been a different type of forest spirit, or perhaps even something that doesn't fit into traditional folklore categories at all. But honestly, I have no definitive explanation for what happened that evening by the lake. All I know for certain is that something invisible approached my father, touched his shoulder in a friendly manner, and asked about his well-being in what seemed like a genuinely caring way. And both of our dogs clearly sensed whatever it was, and found it disturbing enough to growl and remain on high alert. If anyone reading this has experienced something similar or has insights into what this might have been, I'd really appreciate hearing about it. It's been years since it happened, but I still think about that polite, invisible presence fairly regularly, wondering what it wanted and whether it's still out there in those ancient Swedish forests. I was 11 years old when this happened. My older sister Anna was 14, and my younger sister Rebecca was 8. My father worked as a freelance software programmer, and while he made excellent money on his projects, he was heavily in debt to the tune of over $500,000. Combined with my mother's less than stellar budgeting skills, we never had much discretionary income available for family activities. This meant that our family vacations were rare, maybe once every few years, and usually consisted of visiting relatives rather than going to hotels or resorts. We'd learned to find joy in simple pleasures and make the most of whatever opportunities came our way. My dad had just completed a massive, months-long project for a major tech company, and we were celebrating the successful completion with a special movie night. He'd chosen Final Destination because he loved watching scary movies and getting a kick out of scaring the daylights out of my sisters and me. It was one of his favorite pastimes, and we'd grown to enjoy the adrenaline rush of being safely frightened in our own living room. We were about halfway through the movie, right in the middle of one of the more intense scenes, when the phone rang. Dad paused the film and went to answer it, then came back a few minutes later to get my mom. They disappeared into the kitchen for a hushed conversation, while we 3 kids waited impatiently on the couch, eager to see how the movie would end. Rebecca took the opportunity to pause the film completely and capture our dog Duchess, a sweet-tempered golden retriever mix, because she was getting scared and wanted the comfort of holding something warm and fuzzy. When our parents came back about 10 minutes later, they had huge smiles on their faces and announced that we were going to spend the upcoming weekend at a cabin by a lake in the mountains. We didn't know what to make of this sudden change of plans, but we were certainly excited about the prospect of an unexpected adventure. Apparently, the client my father had been working with owned a beautiful lakeside cabin in the Colorado Rockies and had offered to let our family use it for the weekend at a significantly reduced rate. It was Thursday evening, so my mother immediately went into full-scale packing mode, frantically gathering clothes, food, games, and everything else she thought we might need for a mountain getaway. We were so busy with preparations that we never did finish watching the rest of Final Destination that night. The next day after school, we loaded up our family minivan with what seemed like enough supplies for a month-long expedition. The drive to the mountains was about 2.5 hours through increasingly winding roads and spectacular scenery. By the time we arrived at the cabin, it was getting late, and the sun was already beginning to set behind the towering peaks. We unloaded all our gear and immediately began exploring our temporary home. It was a classic ranch-style cabin with rustic log walls, a stone fireplace, and large windows offering stunning views of the surrounding forest and lake. There was a unique little loft area you could climb up to that was about head height above the main floor. It was probably originally designed for storage, but it was about 3 feet tall and spacious enough for all 3 of us kids to hang out comfortably. There were several dozen board games stored up there, so we immediately claimed it as our headquarters and started playing various games while our parents got settled in the main areas of the cabin. When it came time to decide on sleeping arrangements, our parents naturally took the master bedroom, which was the largest room with a comfortable queen-sized bed. Anna, being the oldest and most assertive, claimed the smaller guest room that had a twin bed and some privacy. That left Rebecca and me to share the remaining bedroom, which had a queen-sized bed we could share. Our room had a large window on the right side of the bed, with no curtain or covering, offering a clear view of the forest outside. There was a single lamp on the left side of the bed, which was the only light source in the room. Opposite the bed was a closet that was locked tight, and despite our best efforts and curiosity, we couldn't get it open. I never did figure out what was stored inside there, which only added to the mysterious atmosphere of the place. We went to bed around 11 o'clock that first night. Rebecca was notorious for being a restless sleeper and kicking in her sleep, so I positioned myself by the lamp in case she accidentally knocked it over during the night. I remember lying down and feeling completely exhausted from the excitement and travel of the day. I must have fallen asleep almost instantly, because the next thing I knew, Rebecca was gripping my arm tightly and trying to burrow under me for protection. She was making these small, frightened squeaking sounds, and I couldn't understand what was happening or what had woken me up. I sat up groggily and looked toward her to see what was wrong. That's when I saw it. Something pale and distinctly human-shaped was moving away from our window, disappearing into the darkness of the forest. My sleepy brain took several long moments to process what I was seeing, and then pure terror shot through my entire body like electricity. I was instantly wide awake, my heart hammering in my chest. I shot out of bed and dragged Rebecca with me, both of us stumbling toward our parents' bedroom in our pajamas. We burst through their door, both talking at once, trying to explain what we'd seen. Our parents, groggily awakened from deep sleep, told us we were just imagining things. The stress of being in a new place, combined with the scary movie we'd been watching earlier, had probably caused us to have nightmares or see shadows that weren't really there. My mother told us to go back to our room and try to get some sleep, but if we saw anything else unusual, we should come get them immediately. Much to my current embarrassment and regret, I agreed with their rational explanation and convinced myself that we'd just been having shared nightmares or seeing tree shadows moving in the wind. Rebecca and I went back to our room, but she absolutely refused to sleep near the uncovered window again. We switched positions, so I was by the window, and she was by the lamp, closer to the door and feeling safer. I told her a comforting story to help her fall asleep, and then I quickly fell asleep myself, exhausted from the adrenaline rush. I didn't wake up again until morning, and daylight made everything seem normal and safe again. The next day, we spent hours exploring around the lake, skipping stones, looking for interesting wildlife, and just enjoying the fresh mountain air. It was a perfect family day, and the events of the previous night seemed like a distant, silly memory. For lunch and dinner, we drove into the nearby tourist town, which had numerous small shops, restaurants, and attractions. My parents went into what seemed like every single store, browsing through local crafts, souvenirs, and mountain-themed merchandise. We had a great day as a family, and by the time we returned to the cabin that evening, we were all tired but happy. As we approached the cabin in our minivan, Anna made some silly joke that had everybody laughing and in good spirits. But suddenly, my father held up his hand in a sharp gesture that made everyone stop talking immediately. He took another cautious step toward the cabin and pushed the front door open with just one finger. I thought it was strange that the door wasn't properly latched, but I didn't immediately put together the obvious and concerning implications of finding an unlocked door when we definitely secured it before leaving. "Dad," Anna said nervously as she moved closer to Rebecca and me. But my father gave his head a firm shake to let her know she needed to stay quiet and let him handle the situation. He disappeared inside the cabin for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a minute or two. We stood on the porch in tense silence while my mother called out his name. He finally called back that it was safe for us to come inside. We entered to find him standing in the middle of the living room with a deeply troubled expression on his face. He locked the front door securely once we were all inside, then took my mother to their bedroom for a quick, private conversation. Anna, having caught on to the seriousness of what was happening, tried to distract Rebecca and me by suggesting another round of the board game we'd been enjoying the night before. We hadn't been playing for more than 5 minutes when our parents returned from their hushed conference. My mother busied herself cleaning up the breakfast dishes we'd left in the sink, while my father joined our game, though I could tell his mind was elsewhere. We played for several hours, but there was an underlying tension in the cabin that none of us could shake. Around 9 o'clock that evening, my father announced that we all needed to go to bed. This was unusually early, especially for a weekend, and Anna immediately protested. She was normally allowed to stay up until 10:30 on school nights and even later on weekends. While Anna and Dad had their discussion about bedtime, Rebecca and I climbed into our shared bed. We kept the same sleeping positions as the previous night, with me by the window and Rebecca by the lamp. I read to her for a while to help her relax, and eventually we both drifted off to sleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, I was awakened by my father rushing into our room. He quickly scooped Rebecca out of the bed and grabbed my hand, pulling me toward the door with obvious urgency. In the hallway, I could see Anna getting similar treatment from my mother, both of them moving with quiet efficiency but clear alarm. I became aware of a high-pitched whining sound coming from the living room. Our dog Duchess was sitting at rigid attention by the back door, her fur bristled, and her entire body language showing extreme anxiety and alertness. My father didn't put Rebecca down and didn't let go of my hand as they rushed us all out of the house and into our minivan as quickly as possible. He went back to get Duchess, and then he drove away from that cabin faster than I'd ever seen him drive before. He drove the entire 2.5 hours back home without saying a single word to any of us. It took a full 30 minutes for Duchess to calm down and stop panting nervously. The silence in the van was deafening, and we kids knew better than to ask questions when Dad was in that kind of mood. He finally told Anna what had really happened the next day, but Rebecca and I didn't find out the full truth until several years later when we were old enough to handle it. He'd woken up that final night to what sounded like moaning or crying outside the window of the master bedroom. He jumped up to investigate and discovered that the front door was unlocked. Various items in the kitchen had been moved around, and Duchess had started growling at the back door, which was slightly ajar. He'd immediately secured both doors and gotten our entire family out of there as fast as possible. The next day, he drove back alone to collect our luggage and discovered several sets of footprints outside the window of the bedroom where Rebecca and I had been sleeping. We never found out who or what had been stalking our family during that mountain vacation. But I'm grateful that my father took the situation seriously and got us to safety before anything worse could happen. To this day, I still have vivid memories of that pale, human-shaped figure moving away from our window. And I know it wasn't just a nightmare or my imagination playing tricks on me. This happened a few years ago during the summer of 2020. In mid-July, when the world was still in complete chaos, and everyone was stuck indoors due to the pandemic. My girlfriend at the time, Sarah, my best friend Rob, and his sister Claire all decided we desperately needed a weekend escape into nature. We were going stir-crazy from months of lockdowns, Zoom calls, and isolation. We craved fresh air, hiking trails, and the kind of peace that only comes from being completely disconnected from the digital world. Rob's uncle owns a rustic off-grid cabin deep in the Uinta National Forest in Utah. It's nothing fancy or luxurious, just a basic shelter for serious outdoors enthusiasts. No electrical power, no running water, no modern conveniences. Just a reliable propane stove for cooking, a wood-burning stove for warmth, old military surplus bunk beds, and a traditional outhouse about 50 feet out back behind a cluster of aspen trees. The cabin sits at the end of a rough dirt road that requires a 4-wheel drive vehicle to navigate safely. It's a 45-minute drive from the nearest paved road, winding through dense forest and rocky terrain that gets progressively more challenging as you climb in elevation. When you're finally there, you feel completely cut off from civilization, which was exactly what we wanted at the time. We arrived on Friday afternoon, after a long, bumpy drive through increasingly remote wilderness. The cabin had that distinctive musky smell of unused wooden buildings, a mixture of old timber, dust, and forest air. But it wasn't unpleasant or concerning, just the natural scent of a structure that sits empty for months at a time. Everything inside was intact and undisturbed. No signs of mice, raccoons, or other wildlife getting inside, which surprised me given how remote the location was. We spent the first evening unpacking our gear, organizing our food supplies, and getting acquainted with the propane cooking system. We made a simple but satisfying dinner of pasta with canned sauce, opened a bottle of wine we'd brought, and spent most of that evening outside on the small wooden porch. We played card games by lantern light and spent hours just lying on our backs, watching the most incredible display of stars I'd ever seen in my life. The lack of light pollution was absolutely stunning. The Milky Way stretched across the sky like a river of diamonds, and we could see satellites slowly tracking across the darkness. It was honestly one of the most peaceful, beautiful nights I'd ever experienced in the outdoors. We felt like we'd found our own private slice of paradise. We turned in around 11:30 p.m., all of us exhausted from the drive and the fresh mountain air. Rob and Claire took the bottom bunks on one side of the single main room, while Sarah and I climbed up to the top bunks on the opposite wall. The cabin has one main living area and a tiny kitchen space off to the side. so it's a cozy, intimate space where you can hear everything. We secured the front door using an old-fashioned metal bolt that slides across the frame. It's definitely not modern security by any means, but it felt solid and reassuring. The bolt made a satisfying thunk sound when it slid into place. At 2:30 in the morning, I woke up suddenly. I didn't hear anything specific at first. It was more like my subconscious had pulled me out of deep sleep for reasons I couldn't identify. You know that feeling when your brain wakes you up for no apparent reason, but something feels off. Then I started hearing footsteps. These weren't the quick, light steps of wildlife, or the random sounds of twigs snapping under small animals. These were slow, steady, heavy footsteps on the wooden front porch, like work boots deliberately placed on creaking planks. The rhythm was too regular, too purposeful to be anything natural. I stayed completely still and just listened, my heart starting to race. I thought maybe it was Rob getting up to use the outhouse, but when I carefully peeked over the edge of my bunk, I could see him still wrapped up tightly in his sleeping bag. Same with Claire. Both of them were clearly asleep. I whispered softly to Sarah, and she immediately whispered back, "Do you hear that too?" I just nodded in the darkness, relieved that I wasn't imagining things. The footsteps stopped abruptly. We didn't hear anything else for several minutes, and eventually I worked up the courage to climb down from the bunk, grab my flashlight, and cautiously open the front door to investigate. There was absolutely nothing there. No tracks in the dirt around the porch, no sounds in the surrounding woods, no movement anywhere. Just dead still air, and the towering silhouettes of pine trees against the star-filled sky. I even walked a few feet out toward the small clearing, shining my light in all directions, but found nothing unusual. I came back inside feeling foolish, and we chalked it up to nerves, unfamiliar surroundings, or maybe an animal we had misidentified. We went back to sleep, though it took me a long time to relax. The next morning dawned clear and cool, with that crisp mountain air that makes you feel instantly awake and energized. But when we stepped outside to start our day, I immediately noticed something that made my stomach drop. The old wooden storage shed behind the cabin, about 25 yards into the woods, was standing wide open. We definitely hadn't gone in there the day before. Rob had even made a joke about it when we first arrived, saying it looked like the perfect set piece for a horror movie. It had a warped, sagging door and was half covered in bright green moss. Inside the shed, we found old hand tools, chopped firewood, rusted nails, and various pieces of random junk accumulated over years of use. Nothing dangerous or particularly interesting, just the typical contents of a wilderness storage building. But it was weird that the door was open, and it looked like someone had definitely moved things around inside. An old splitting axe was leaning against the door frame, instead of being stored properly with the other tools. A coiled length of rope had clearly been uncoiled and then dropped carelessly on the ground. Claire even mentioned that the interior smelled faintly like tobacco smoke, which none of us had brought or used. That second night, we were all a bit more on edge than we wanted to admit. We double-checked the door bolt, moved our backpacks closer together for some psychological comfort, and even made nervous jokes about Uncle Larry's haunted storage shed. But the joking didn't really help the growing sense of unease. Around 1:45 in the morning, something happened that all four of us heard clearly and simultaneously. The unmistakable sound of the front door, slowly creaking open. It was long and drawn out, like in a classic horror movie. That distinctive squeal of old hinges under stress. The thing is, when we immediately checked, the door was still securely bolted shut. It hadn't moved at all, but we had all heard it, no question. The sound was loud enough and distinctive enough that Rob sat up immediately and said, "Is someone trying to get inside?" Once again, we searched the area thoroughly. No animals, no wind strong enough to cause strange sounds. No movement anywhere in the trees surrounding the cabin. But the air felt different somehow, charged with tension like the atmosphere before a severe thunderstorm. Except there weren't any clouds in the crystal clear night sky. We barely slept the rest of that night, taking turns staying awake to listen for any unusual sounds. Every small noise, every settling board, every distant crack of a branch had us all on high alert. The next morning, our third day at the cabin, we discovered something that made us seriously consider leaving early. There was a clear handprint on the outside of one of the back windows. It was faint but unmistakable, like someone had pressed their bare palm against the glass and left a slight residue from skin oils. None of us remembered touching that particular window. Claire swore it wasn't hers, and said she hadn't even gone near that side of the cabin since we'd arrived. The handprint was positioned at about shoulder height for an average-sized adult, too high to be accidental contact from a child or animal. That was enough to make us pack up and leave a full day early. On our way out, we stopped at the nearest location with cell service and called Rob's uncle to tell him what had happened. To our surprise, he just laughed and said something casual like, "Oh, you met the curious visitor. Don't worry, it's completely harmless." He went on to explain that other people had mentioned footsteps, door sounds, and various unexplained phenomena over the years, but that nothing bad had ever actually happened to anyone. He treated it like a quirky feature of the property, rather than something to be concerned about. He never mentioned any of this when we were planning the trip, which frankly would have been helpful information to have beforehand. So I'm not saying the place is definitely haunted, but something unusual was definitely going on out there. Could it have been wildlife? I suppose it's possible, but we've all spent enough time camping and hiking to recognize the difference between animal sounds and something more deliberate and purposeful. This felt different. It felt like someone or something was out there, observing us, testing our reactions, maybe even trying to communicate in some way. We've done plenty of camping and wilderness trips since then, but never back to that particular cabin. I'm still trying to make sense of what we experienced during those 3 strange days in the Utah mountains. The abandoned house and its deadly warning. When I lived in rural Maine during my freshman year of college, my boyfriend at the time, Derek, took me on what he called an adventure drive in his beat-up pickup truck. He said he wanted to show me something really interesting that he'd learned about from one of his college professors, who taught local history and folklore. We already lived pretty far out in the middle of nowhere, but Derek drove us even further into what felt like the absolute depths of rural Maine wilderness. We traveled on increasingly narrow roads that seemed to wind endlessly through dense forest, getting progressively more isolated with each mile. We drove for what felt like hours on this particular back road that stretched for 5 to 8 miles, with nothing but thick forest on both sides. No houses, no mailboxes, no road signs, no driveways. Absolutely nothing that indicated human habitation or civilization. Just towering pine and oak trees pressing in from both sides, creating a tunnel-like effect that made the afternoon light seem dimmer and more mysterious. Eventually, Derek pulled over near a slight break in the tree line, where we could see what appeared to be a very overgrown, barely visible old driveway. It was chained off at the road with heavy links and posted with a weathered, barely readable sign that warned private property. No trespassing in faded red letters. We parked Derek's truck on the shoulder and decided to walk in about half a mile down this forgotten driveway. The path was completely overgrown with weeds, small saplings, and thorny bushes that caught at our clothes as we pushed through. It was clear that no vehicles had used this route in many years, possibly decades. At the end of this neglected trail, we discovered an old abandoned log house that looked like something from another era entirely. I couldn't determine exactly when it had been built, but it was obviously old enough to predate any connection to the electrical grid. There were no power lines, no electrical outlets visible anywhere, and no modern conveniences that you'd expect in a 20th century home. The house had an eerie, unsettling quality that immediately made me uncomfortable, but Derek seemed fascinated by it. He explained that the last property owner had included a very unusual clause in their will, stating that absolutely no changes could be made to the property after their death. No agriculture, no major renovations, no development of any kind. This strange legal restriction was apparently why the land had never been resold or developed, since potential buyers couldn't do anything meaningful with it. Derek had been there before with some friends and knew how to get inside through a back entrance where we could break in without causing too much damage to the structure. I was hesitant about trespassing, but my curiosity got the better of me, and I followed him around to the rear of the house. I don't remember exactly how we got up to the second floor, whether we entered through an upstairs door somehow or climbed internal stairs once we were inside. My memory of that day is a bit fuzzy, since this was back in the fall of 2011, when I was just 18 and not always making the best decisions. What I do remember very clearly is being on this loft area that overlooked the entire interior of the house. It was a dangerous setup with no safety railing at all, just a 15+ foot drop straight down to the main floor. There might not have been any internal stairs or ladder at all, which would explain why accessing the loft was so challenging and memorable. The main floor below had an old cast iron wood burning stove and a primitive countertop area that must have served as the kitchen. But otherwise, the place was pretty sparse. Everything was constructed entirely of wood, with no modern materials anywhere. There was no sink in the kitchen area and no bathroom facilities, which meant the house had no plumbing system either. It was like stepping back in time to a much simpler, more primitive way of living. The loft where we found ourselves had literally thousands of dead flies covering every surface. Not just a few dozen or even a few hundred, but thousands upon thousands of them scattered across the wooden floor, piled in corners, and covering every horizontal surface we could see. It was creepy and disgusting in a way that immediately put me on edge. I know that flies can get trapped in abandoned buildings over the years and die naturally, but the sheer number of them was just incredibly unnerving. What made it even worse was that they didn't seem to be decayed or turned to dust the way you'd expect after years of being dead. They looked relatively fresh, which didn't make any sense given how long the house had obviously been abandoned. Derek, for reasons I still don't understand, decided that this fly-covered loft in a creepy abandoned house was the perfect place to smoke marijuana. I really didn't want to stay there any longer than necessary, but he laid out a blanket over the carpet of dead flies and settled in to roll a joint like we were at a pleasant picnic spot. I did take a couple of hits when he offered, but I started getting an increasingly uneasy feeling about the whole situation, so I stopped partaking pretty quickly. I'm a regular cannabis user and generally pretty comfortable in unusual situations, but this particular environment was just wrong on multiple levels. Then I suddenly realized that the sun was setting much faster than I had expected, and we were losing daylight at an alarming rate. The house very quickly developed this terrifying, oppressive atmosphere of impending doom. I knew with absolute certainty that I needed to get out of there immediately, before full darkness set in. I expressed my concerns to Derek multiple times, each attempt sounding more desperate and urgent than the last. But he wasn't worried about anything and seemed determined to take his sweet time with everything. He slowly rolled himself a cigarette, then methodically took all kinds of unnecessary items out of his pockets, laid them out on the blanket like he was organizing a display, and then slowly put everything away again. It was incredibly frustrating that he wasn't taking my growing panic seriously, and I had this overwhelming sense of urgency to get out of that house before something terrible happened. The feeling was so strong it was almost physically painful. I finally gave up trying to convince him and decided to get out of the house first. I made my way down from the loft as quickly as possible and started practically running down that half-mile long dirt driveway toward his truck. Derek shuffled along behind me at his own leisurely pace, fumbling with things in his hands and seemingly oblivious to my distress. I managed to get out of the woods just as we were losing the last traces of daylight before true darkness set in. Keep in mind that this rural country road had absolutely no street lights anywhere along its entire length. So once the sun went down, we would be in complete darkness, except for Derek's truck headlights. Even though Derek had flashlights with him, I didn't feel that artificial light would provide any real safety or protection from whatever was making me feel so threatened. I felt strongly that we were being watched by something, and that whatever it was had very negative, possibly dangerous intentions toward us. I don't know if I was overreacting to the creepy atmosphere, or if Derek was just too stoned to recognize the potential danger we were in. But I never really trusted his judgment again after that experience. I don't know why I allowed myself to get into such a potentially dangerous situation with someone who was so dismissive of my legitimate safety concerns. The relationship didn't last much longer after that incident, and Derek is definitely no longer part of my life. Looking back, I think that abandoned house was trying to warn me about more than just immediate physical danger. It was showing me that Derek wasn't someone I could rely on when things got scary or difficult. Sometimes the most important lessons come from the places and situations that make us most uncomfortable. And that fly-infested loft in the middle of nowhere, Maine, taught me to trust my instincts about both dangerous places and unreliable people. I've never gone back to that area, and I have no desire to find out what would have happened if we'd stayed in that house after dark. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, especially when every instinct you have is screaming at you to get away as fast as possible. Lake Tahoe nightmare. Something in the forest have lived in Southern California my entire life. And if you know anything about California's geography, you'll understand that it's incredibly diverse. Up north, you have mountains covered in dense forests and pristine wilderness areas, while down south, where I'm from, it's much more urban and developed, with sprawling cities and suburban communities stretching as far as the eye can see. This past summer, I decided to take my first real trip to Lake Tahoe, which is absolutely one of the most beautiful places in California. It's a massive alpine lake surrounded by towering mountains and thick forests, and it was my first time experiencing the northern part of the state. I was really excited to get away from the constant noise and activity of Southern California city life. I'm going to break this story up into daily segments to make it easier to follow, because each day brought its own set of increasingly disturbing experiences. Day 1, I arrived at the rental cabin around 5 o'clock in the afternoon, after an exhausting 8-hour drive through winding mountain roads. The cabin was nestled among tall pine trees and had a rustic, cozy atmosphere that immediately made me feel relaxed. I was incredibly tired from the long drive and the stress of navigating unfamiliar mountain highways, so I went straight to the bedroom loft and collapsed on the comfortable bed. The silence was absolutely incredible. It was like being transported to a completely different world. I was so accustomed to the constant sound of cars zooming by, people talking and shouting right outside my house, sirens, airplanes, and all the other noise pollution of urban life. But here, it was genuinely quiet in a way I'd never experienced before. I fell asleep fairly quickly, probably within 15 or 20 minutes of lying down. About 4 hours into my sleep, I suddenly jerked awake for no apparent reason. I looked around the dimly lit loft area, trying to figure out what had woken me up, when I started hearing strange tapping sounds. I listened carefully and looked around, trying to determine where the sound was coming from, but I couldn't pinpoint the source. It sounded like someone was deliberately tapping on the glass part of the back door downstairs, like they were trying to get my attention, or maybe testing to see if anyone was home. I figured I was probably just being paranoid from being alone in an unfamiliar place, so I managed to convince myself it was nothing serious and went back to sleep. Day 2, nothing particularly unusual happened during the second day, and I slept fine without any disturbances. I spent the day exploring the lake area, taking photographs, and just enjoying the incredible natural beauty of the Sierra Nevada mountains. Day 3, this is when things started getting genuinely frightening. I woke up very early in the morning, maybe around 4 o'clock, to the sound of something crashing near the attic ladder that was positioned directly behind the couch I'd been sleeping on downstairs. I didn't move a muscle. I just lay there listening intently, my heart starting to race. Then I heard what sounded like several distinct footsteps moving around downstairs. You know that unmistakable feeling you get when you sense someone staring at you? That's exactly how I felt, like invisible eyes were fixed on me from somewhere in the darkness. I was lying on my side, staring straight ahead toward the wall, when I suddenly felt somebody or something crawl over me on the bed. I could feel their hands pressing down on either side of my body, supporting their weight as they positioned themselves directly above me. I knew with absolute certainty that their face was just inches away from mine, close enough that I should have been able to feel their breath. As I mentioned, I was facing straight ahead toward the wall, and there was no way I was going to turn my head to see who or what was hovering over me. I was completely paralyzed with terror, unable to move or even breathe normally. They stayed in that position for what felt like forever, just looming over me in complete silence. Finally, I felt them slowly crawl backwards and then climb off the couch entirely. Then I heard what sounded like a dog letting out a muffled bark, followed immediately by someone making a quiet shushing sound and saying, "Good girl," in a gentle voice, like they were praising a pet for being quiet. The presence remained in the room for what felt like an eternity. I could sense them standing there, maybe watching me, maybe waiting for me to react. Eventually, I heard slow, deliberate footsteps walking toward the back door, followed by the sound of the door opening and closing. Still, I didn't dare move. I was absolutely paralyzed with fear and remained frozen in the same position for hours, too terrified to even lift my head or look around the room. Needless to say, I didn't go back to sleep for the rest of the night. When I finally felt safe enough to check on my friends, I discovered that none of them had left their rooms during the night. I told them about my terrifying experience, but they said I was just being paranoid and letting my imagination run wild. I halfway agreed with them at the time, thinking maybe I'd had some kind of vivid nightmare or sleep paralysis episode. Our day continued as planned, and we spent hours at the lake swimming, sunbathing, and just enjoying the beautiful weather. Later on day 3 after our day at the lake, we came back to a quiet and peaceful cabin. The caretakers had mentioned that there was a river a bit further back into the woods, about a 15-minute walk along a marked trail. My friends decided to stay back at the cabin to rest and maybe take naps. So I grabbed some bug spray, a small backpack with snacks and my phone, and decided to explore the river area by myself. The trail seemed pretty straightforward at first. There was tall grass on both sides of the narrow path, and while it was clearly not a heavily used trail, it was easy enough to follow and navigate. When I reached the riverbank, I found 2 weathered picnic tables positioned near the water's edge. I didn't want to get eaten alive by mosquitoes, but I'd stupidly worn sandals instead of proper hiking boots. I put my backpack on one of the tables and started walking back toward the cabin to get better footwear. For some strange reason, the path seemed completely different on the return trip. What had been a straightforward trail just minutes earlier was now covered in rough terrain, fallen logs, and obstacles that I didn't remember seeing before. It was like the forest had somehow rearranged itself while I was at the river. I also noticed that the tall grass on both sides of the path had been severely disturbed. It looked like something absolutely huge, and I mean gigantic, had walked over or through the grass, flattening it in a pattern that suggested something much larger than any normal forest animal. At first, I thought maybe it was evidence of a bear, since the locals had warned us that bears were definitely a problem in the area during this time of year. But the sheer size and scope of the disturbance made me question that explanation. It looked like whatever had passed through was significantly larger than even a full-grown black bear. I was pretty unsettled by this discovery, but I managed to make it back to the cabin and then return to the river area. I kept telling myself I was just freaking myself out unnecessarily, and that I should try to enjoy the beautiful natural setting. I sat down at one of the picnic tables and tried to relax while watching the river flow by. The sound of moving water was soothing, and for a while I felt peaceful and safe. After sitting there for maybe 20 or 30 minutes, I started getting that familiar feeling that something was watching me. I looked around, expecting to see one of my friends coming down the trail to join me or maybe play a prank. But there was nobody visible anywhere. Across on the far side of the river, I noticed that some of the brush and undergrowth looked disturbed or shaken up. There was a small clearing in the bushes that appeared to be blocked off by two logs arranged in an X shape, almost like a deliberate barrier or marker. The longer I sat in that spot, the more anxious and worried I became. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something hidden behind the thick brush on the other side of the river. Something that was studying me, but staying carefully out of sight. I decided to walk downstream a bit, hoping to find some wildlife like fish or frogs, or maybe just to change my perspective and shake off the creepy feelings. But I found nothing. No fish jumping, no frogs croaking, no birds singing. Just an oppressive silence broken only by mosquitoes, and there were a lot of them. Disappointed with the lack of any interesting wildlife, I went back to sit at the picnic table. That's when I heard it. It was a sound I absolutely cannot adequately describe in words. It was like a scream, but also like a gurgle, as if whatever was making the noise had a mouth full of water or blood. It was completely inhuman, unlike anything I'd ever heard from any animal I was familiar with. I froze completely. My rational mind was screaming at me to run for my life, but my body just wouldn't respond. I was paralyzed with terror, unable to move or even think clearly. Then I heard rustling in the bushes directly behind me, the same area I'd been worried about earlier. Then that horrible scream sound again, but this time much louder, closer, and more aggressive. It was the loudest, most terrifying sound I'd ever heard in my life. Finally, my survival instincts kicked in, and I ran. I sprinted through the forest as fast as my legs could carry me, crashing through undergrowth and leaping over fallen logs. What should have been a quick 10-minute trip back to the cabin turned into a nightmare of getting lost and panicking in increasingly dense forest. After about 10 minutes of running at full speed, I realized I had no idea where I was. I stopped for a few moments, frantically looking around for anything that looked familiar. Eventually, I spotted the wooden bridge I had crossed earlier on my way to the river, and I started running toward it again. As I was running, I kept thinking to myself, why didn't that thing kill me? I had stopped for a good minute when I first heard the scream, standing there like a perfect target. I could hear something large crashing through the forest behind me, obviously chasing me, but it felt like it was playing some kind of twisted game. Every time I stopped to catch my breath or try to get my bearings, whatever was following me would stop too. It was like it was deliberately toying with me, seeing how scared it could make me without actually attacking. I finally made it back to the cabin, but instead of going inside immediately, I stood on the front porch facing the forest. I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary among the trees, but I knew with absolute certainty that it was still out there somewhere, watching me. I didn't want to turn my back on the forest, so I just sat on the porch steps for hours, silently crying and occasionally checking my phone. I was too terrified to go inside and too scared to look away from the tree line. The only thing I can even compare this creature to is a Wendigo from Native American folklore. All I know for sure is that I will never, ever go back to that river area again. Day 4 and final day on our last night, we burned some sage that we found in the cabin before going to bed, hoping it might provide some spiritual protection. Around 4 o'clock in the morning, my friend Brett came up to me and said he couldn't sleep. We watched television quietly for a while, and then we both heard those same tapping sounds on the back window that I'd experienced on the first night. The tapping lasted for several seconds and seemed to come in deliberate intervals, like some kind of code or signal. Brett managed to get a video recording of the sounds, but we were both too scared to watch it or analyze it in detail. After about 10 minutes, the tapping stopped completely. Brett and I took turns staying awake and sleeping, making sure one of us was always alert and listening for any unusual sounds. We were both woken up around dawn by loud banging sounds coming from the storage shed behind the cabin. We went to investigate, but found absolutely nothing there. No signs of disturbance, no evidence of what could have made such loud noises. I'm leaving in just 2 hours, and I'm incredibly excited to get back to city life and leave this place and all its disturbing phenomena behind me. Probably against my better judgment, I decided to go back to the river one more time to take some photographs as evidence of my experience. Something very strange happened while I was out there that I really can't explain logically. I heard loud gurgling noises again, but this time they were accompanied by what sounded like soft, distant music. I was pretty deep in the forest, and there was absolutely no one else out there with me. No other hikers, no campers, no one who could have been playing music. When I got back to the cabin, I had Brett go up into the attic space while the rest of us watched from below. We wanted to make sure there wasn't someone or something hiding up there. There was nothing visible, but I'm not sure if that makes me feel better or worse about the whole situation. I did find some sage stored under one of the kitchen cabinets, which makes me wonder if previous visitors had left it there for protection against whatever haunts this area of the forest. I'm an avid hiker and backpacker who spent countless weekends exploring remote wilderness areas throughout Scotland and northern England. Recently, I went on what was supposed to be a straightforward hiking trip in the Scottish Highlands with a close-knit group of friends. We had planned to stay overnight at a mountain bothy before tackling some challenging hill climbs the following day. For those who aren't familiar with Scottish hiking culture, a bothy is essentially a basic, no-frills shelter positioned in remote wilderness areas, usually many miles from the nearest road or village. Sometimes they're converted old farmhouses, sometimes they're purpose-built stone shelters, and sometimes they're just weathered wooden sheds. The key features are that they're completely free to use, They don't require any advance booking or reservations, and they typically offer just the bare essentials. 4 walls, a roof, maybe a fireplace, and some basic furniture. The concept is beautifully simple. You just show up, make yourself at home, respect the space and other users, and leave it clean for the next group of hikers. It's a wonderful system that allows serious outdoor enthusiasts to explore some of the most remote and spectacular landscapes in Scotland without having to carry heavy camping equipment. We found ourselves at a particularly atmospheric old farmhouse that had been converted into a bothy sometime in the recent past. According to the weathered information board outside, the original structure had been built back in the early 1800s, making it well over 200 years old. The building was spacious enough for all 6 of us to spread out comfortably, with sleeping areas upstairs and a large common room downstairs where we could cook, eat, and socialize. The weather that evening was typically Scottish, cold, damp, and unpredictable. We were grateful to have solid stone walls and a reliable roof over our heads. We quickly got a roaring fire going in the large stone fireplace, which not only provided warmth, but also created a cozy, almost magical atmosphere. The combination of flickering flames, ancient stone walls, and the sound of wind and rain outside made for one of those perfect wilderness evenings that remind you why you love spending time in remote places. It was one of those ideal nights when you're in the absolute middle of nowhere, completely disconnected from modern civilization, with nothing but the crackling fire for entertainment and the comfortable companionship of good friends. We spent hours just talking, sharing stories, discussing our hiking plans for the next day, and enjoying the rare pleasure of having no electronic distractions whatsoever. No one else was around as far as we knew, which wasn't surprising given how remote this particular bothy was. It required a good 3 to 4 hours of serious hiking from the nearest accessible road. So it definitely wasn't a destination for casual day hikers or tourists looking for easy adventures. At about 3 o'clock in the morning, I woke up suddenly. It wasn't because of any specific noise or disturbance that I could immediately identify, but rather just an uncomfortable feeling that something wasn't quite right. You know that sensation when your subconscious pulls you out of deep sleep because it's detected something that your conscious mind hasn't processed yet. I lay there for several minutes, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling and get back to sleep. But then I started hearing something that made my blood run cold. The unmistakable sound of the front door creaking open slowly, followed by heavy, deliberate footsteps moving around the main room downstairs. These weren't the light, quick steps of a small animal, or the random sounds of wind moving objects around. These were the measured, purposeful steps of someone walking around, like they were exploring or searching for something. I froze completely, my mind immediately racing through possibilities. Could it be one of my friends getting up in the middle of the night to use the outdoor toilet or check on something? Could it be another hiker arriving very late and looking for a place to sleep? The footsteps continued for what felt like several minutes, slow and steady, like someone methodically walking around the downstairs area. Then there was the unmistakable sound of the door slamming shut with considerable force, followed by complete and utter silence. By this point, we were all wide awake and fully alert. That door slam had been loud enough to wake everyone, and there was this strange tension in the air that we could all feel, but none of us wanted to acknowledge out loud. It was one of those situations where everyone knows something unusual is happening, but no one wants to be the first person to say it. We couldn't ignore what we'd all heard, so we decided we needed to investigate. Moving as quietly as possible, we all crept downstairs together without saying a word to each other. Everyone could feel that strange, electric tension in the atmosphere, but nobody wanted to voice their concerns and make the situation feel even more ominous. The footsteps had been loud and clear enough to cause genuine concern, but the way they'd stopped so abruptly when the door slammed had all of us feeling deeply unsettled. It wasn't the kind of sound pattern you'd expect from a confused hiker or someone just passing through. We carefully opened the front door and stepped outside into the pitch-black Highland night. There was absolutely nothing out there. No flashlight beams from other hikers. No sounds of anyone walking around or moving through the area. Not even any animal sounds in the distance. This was an incredibly remote location, literally miles away from any roads, villages, or other buildings. The idea that someone would be casually walking around at 3 o'clock in the morning was already pretty unlikely. But to have them completely disappear without a trace was deeply unsettling. We thought maybe there was another group of hikers who had set up camp nearby. Perhaps someone who'd pitched a tent in the area and had wandered over to check if the bothy had space available. But after searching the immediate area with our headlamps, we found no evidence of anyone camping nearby. No tents, no gear, no footprints, no disturbed ground. Nothing that would indicate recent human presence. We stood outside in the cold night air for quite a while, listening intently and trying to make sense of what we'd experienced. But there was nothing to hear, except the typical highland sounds of wind moving through the hills, and the distant call of a night bird. The complete absence of any evidence was almost more disturbing than if we'd found clear signs of an intruder. At least then we'd have a rational explanation for what had happened. After several minutes of standing around in the darkness feeling foolish, we went back inside and secured the door. The whole incident felt deeply wrong, but we tried to convince ourselves that it must have been some kind of acoustic trick caused by the wind, or maybe the old building settling in ways that created footstep-like sounds. But deep down, none of us really believed those rational explanations. The strange thing is, the next morning when we were packing up our gear to continue our hiking trip, we discovered some additional information that put our nighttime experience in a completely different context. A local shepherd we met on the trail told us that this particular bothy was well known throughout the hiking community for unexplained phenomena. According to him, many people who had stayed there over the years had reported hearing footsteps when no one else was around, doors opening and closing by themselves, and the persistent feeling of being watched by invisible presences. The more I thought about our experience, the more unsettling it became. It wasn't just the footsteps or the door sounds that bothered me. It was the oppressive silence that followed, the way everything went completely still immediately after the door slammed. It was the total absence of any evidence that anyone had been there at all. I'm not usually someone who believes in ghosts or supernatural explanations for unusual events, but I have to admit that night made me reconsider some of my assumptions about what's possible in places with long, complex histories. I've stayed in dozens of remote bothies and mountain shelters over the years, and I've never experienced anything even remotely similar to what happened that night. I've heard plenty of strange sounds in the wilderness, from wind creating unusual acoustics to animals moving around buildings. But this felt fundamentally different. It felt purposeful, intelligent, like someone was actually there with us. I've been back to the Scottish Highlands many times since then, but I've never returned to that specific bothy. Some places just leave an impression on you that's impossible to shake. And that old farmhouse definitely falls into that category. If you're ever hiking in that area and decide to stay overnight, keep your ears open. You might just hear something that challenges your understanding of what's possible in those ancient, mysterious hills. This happened about 4 or 5 years ago, back when I lived with my mother in a converted shed on a working farm surrounded by dense woodland. Our little home was part of a larger piece of farmland that had been subdivided and sold off to different families over the years. So we did have neighbors, though they were roughly half a kilometer away in each direction through the trees. I actually loved this setup because it gave us the perfect balance of privacy and security. We were isolated enough that we could live quietly without being bothered by neighbors or traffic, but close enough to other people that I could get help quickly if I ever needed it. That sense of security is what gave me the confidence to take long walks alone at night, something that in retrospect was incredibly foolish and dangerous. During that period of my life, I regularly went for solitary walks between the hours of 7 and 8 p.m., though sometimes I'd start earlier or later, depending on my mood and schedule. I was probably 16 or 17 years old at the time, and I thought I was invincible the way most teenagers do. Sometimes I even went out for walks at 2 o'clock in the morning when I was feeling restless and couldn't sleep, driven by insomnia and youthful stupidity. Looking back now, this was an incredibly reckless thing to do, especially for a young person alone in such a remote area. After the incident I'm about to describe, I never walked after 6 p.m. ever again, and I always made sure there was at least some sunlight remaining when I set out for any outdoor activities. The route I always took was a predictable road circuit that formed a rough loop through our rural area. The first part of the walk was out in the open, passing in front of all the other farms, including our own. If anything had happened during this section, at least one person would have noticed me missing or heard me calling for help. The cell phone reception was also pretty reliable in this area, so I would have been able to call someone for assistance if needed. The second half of my usual route, however, was much more isolated and potentially dangerous. It was concealed by about 200 meters of thick woods that separated the farms from a back road that stretched for a full 2 kilometers behind all the properties. This section of the walk took me through dense forest where I was completely hidden from view and cut off from any immediate help. It was during this isolated, wooded portion of my walk that I had the terrifying encounter that changed my nighttime habits forever. It was late at night, though I can't remember the exact time. What I do remember clearly is that it was pitch black, except for the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness ahead of me. I I was approaching the turn in my usual loop that would bring me back out into the open area near the farms when I heard something that made my blood run cold. Help, it was spoken in this completely monotone voice that repeatedly asked for help without any emotion, urgency, or panic whatsoever. The voice was flat, mechanical, almost robotic in its delivery. It didn't sound like someone who was actually in distress or genuinely needed assistance. Help, help, I took my earphones out and turned off my music to make sure I was hearing correctly. But the voice didn't stop. It just kept repeating the same word over and over again, in that same eerily emotionless tone. Help, help, help. A very stupid part of me almost responded immediately, because my first instinct was genuinely, oh no, someone's in trouble and needs my help. I had this naive, almost childish urge to call out and ask what was wrong, despite being a teenager who should have known better. But then my brain finally kicked in, and I realized that approaching that voice was probably the most dangerous thing I could possibly do. Everything about the situation felt wrong. The emotionless tone, the repetitive nature of the plea, the fact that it was coming from deep in the woods at night, all of it screamed danger. So I started quietly backing away, trying to put distance between myself and whatever was making that unsettling sound. Unfortunately, my cat Luna had followed me on the walk that night, as she sometimes did when she was feeling adventurous. But instead of backing away with me like a sensible animal, she was actually walking toward the voice, softly hissing as she moved. I remember desperately trying to get her to come back to me without making any noise that might alert whatever was out there to my presence, just in case they hadn't noticed me yet. But Luna was fixated on whatever was calling for help, her predatory instincts obviously triggered by something I couldn't see or understand. I was getting increasingly scared and didn't want to stay there for even one more second. So I made the decision to rush forward and grab her. I scooped her up in my arms, turned around, and started running back toward our house as fast as my legs could carry me. I don't know if it was smart or stupid of me to turn my back on the voice while I was running away. I was making so much noise crashing through the underbrush and breathing heavily that there was no way whatever was out there didn't know exactly where I was and what direction I was heading. I had no way of knowing if they were following me or giving chase. I was absolutely terrified the entire time I was running. My imagination kept conjuring up images of some shadowy figure pursuing me through the woods, reaching out with clawed hands to grab me from behind. Even though I couldn't hear anyone or anything chasing me, I never once slowed down until I was back inside our house, with the door locked securely behind me. But the story doesn't end there, because despite how absolutely terrifying the experience had been, there was still a part of me that was genuinely concerned about whoever had been calling for help. What if they really were in trouble? What if someone was injured or lost and genuinely needed assistance? The possibility that I had abandoned someone who actually needed help was eating at me. So I made another incredibly stupid decision. I asked my mother to drive me back to the location where I'd heard the voice, thinking that we could safely investigate from inside our car and maybe provide help if someone was actually in distress. This was probably the second dumbest thing I could have done, but at least I had the sense to bring backup and stay in a vehicle rather than going back on foot by myself. We drove to the approximate area where I'd heard the voice and parked with the engine running and doors unlocked, ready to make a quick escape if necessary. We called out several times, asking if anyone was there and if they needed help, but nobody answered our calls. We didn't see any lights, hear any responses, or detect any signs of human presence whatsoever. Neither of us were stupid enough to get out of the car and conduct a more thorough search on foot, especially given how creepy the whole situation felt. We drove home having seen nothing and no one, but the incident still bothered me tremendously. The next morning, I was still concerned enough that I convinced my mother to drive back to the area one more time so we could search the immediate vicinity in daylight. I wanted to make sure there wasn't someone injured or unconscious who hadn't been able to respond to our calls the night before. We searched the area as thoroughly as we could from the safety of our vehicle, and even walked around a little bit in broad daylight. But we found absolutely nothing. No indication that anyone had been there. No signs of struggle or distress. No evidence that anyone had needed help. There was no body, which I'll admit was one of the more dramatic possibilities I'd been worried about. I thought maybe someone had been in medical distress or shock, which could have explained the emotionless voice and lack of response when we returned later. I was afraid we might find someone who had died during the night because we hadn't provided immediate assistance. But we found absolutely nothing. And to this day, I have no idea who that voice belonged to or why they were making such a strange, monotone call for help in the middle of the woods at night. My mind has naturally come up with some pretty chilling conclusions and theories over the years. Could it have been someone trying to lure naive people into the woods for nefarious purposes? Kidnappers, serial killers, or other predators who use fake distress calls to attract potential victims. These are all classic horror story scenarios that unfortunately do happen in real life sometimes. The emotionless, repetitive nature of the voice definitely suggests it wasn't someone who was genuinely in distress. People who are actually hurt or scared don't usually call for help in such a mechanical, unemotional way. They're usually panicked, upset, providing details about what's wrong, or at least showing some kind of human emotion. But I guess I'll never really know for sure what was out there in the woods that night, calling for help in that deeply unsettling, monotone voice. And honestly, I'm not sure I want to know. Some mysteries are probably better left unsolved, especially when the potential answers could be truly horrifying. What I do know is that the experience taught me to trust my instincts about dangerous situations, even when part of me wants to be helpful or heroic. Sometimes the smartest thing you can do is run away as fast as possible and worry about the consequences later. I live near a very large, heavily populated national park that's known throughout the region for its spectacular hiking trails, camping opportunities, and unfortunately, its strange and unexplained phenomena. Locals here, myself included, are pretty well aware of the unusual things that happen in and around this vast wilderness area. We've all heard stories about strange sounds echoing through the forests at night, encounters with creatures that don't match any known wildlife, and the disturbing number of people who simply vanish without a trace in these woods. I've dealt with some of these mysterious occurrences myself during various hiking trips, and even just while relaxing in the more accessible areas of the park. But here's one encounter that still gives me chills and makes me question everything I thought I knew about what's possible in these ancient forests. This happened when I was about 10 years old, during a visit to my grandmother's house that sits deep in what most people would call the absolute middle of nowhere. My grandmother's property is so remote that the only way to reach it is via a badly maintained gravel road that's been almost completely washed away by years of rain and erosion. Without a reliable four-wheel drive vehicle with high clearance, you're simply not getting out there at all. My cousins lived in a small mobile home, with their mothers situated right below my grandmother's main house on the same property. We spent countless hours playing elaborate games that usually involved me being chased around the property by my older cousins, since I was the youngest member of our extended family group. During this particular visit, my grandmother was in the hospital receiving treatment, and my aunt was staying there with her to provide support and assistance. This meant that our older cousin Derek had been left in charge of watching all of us younger kids, while the adults were away dealing with the medical situation. Derek was and still is the only older cousin that we held in high regard and actually respected. Unlike some of our other relatives, he would play around with us and tease us in good-natured ways, but he also genuinely cared about our safety and well-being. He was responsible enough that the adults trusted him to keep us out of serious trouble. We spent the entire day playing various outdoor games around the extensive property, running through the woods, building forts, and just enjoying the freedom that comes with being kids in a place where you can make as much noise as you want without bothering any neighbors. As evening approached, we decided to continue our games even after it got dark, which added an element of excitement and danger that we all found thrilling. We played hide and seek, tag, manhunt, and whatever other games we could think of that worked well in the darkness. Of course, as the youngest, I was typically the one being hunted, while everyone else worked as a team to find me. During one particularly intense round of manhunt, I ran pretty far into the dense woods on the opposite side of the property from the houses, and found what I thought was an excellent hiding spot behind a large fallen log. I could hear my cousins getting closer to my position, their voices and footsteps growing louder as they searched through the underbrush. So I decided to make a break for it and find a new hiding spot before they discovered me. We ended up running and chasing each other all the way to the very back boundary of the property, which was almost a full mile from the main house and completely surrounded by thick, untouched forest. It was in this remote area that we spotted what we thought was Derek. He was standing at the edge of the tree line, just barely visible in the dim light filtering through the canopy. When he saw us, he looked directly at our group and made this strange growling sound, almost like he was trying to be playful and scary at the same time. We all immediately assumed this was part of the game, that Derek was trying to add a new element of fun and terror to our nighttime activities. So we ran away from him, laughing and shrieking with excitement, thinking it was all just another part of our elaborate chase game. We ran back toward the main part of the property and emerged onto the gravel road that connected the different buildings. As we were running down this road, we saw the figure we thought was Derek walk out of the tree line again. But he did it in this weird, almost theatrical way. He moved slowly and deliberately, with an exaggerated gait that seemed designed to be menacing or intimidating. We continued treating it like a game and ran toward the main house, planning to barricade ourselves inside and make Derek work to get to us. We thought we were being clever and adding to the fun by creating an obstacle for him to overcome. We rushed into the living room and started moving furniture in front of the front door. First, we moved a couple of chairs. Then we decided we needed something heavier and more substantial. So we began loudly dragging the big wooden coffee table across the floor to create a more serious barricade. As we were making all this noise, scraping furniture across the hardwood floor, and laughing about our ingenious plan, Derek suddenly emerged from the master bedroom, rubbing his eyes and looking irritated and confused. He had obviously been asleep and was annoyed that we'd woken him up with all our loud furniture moving. The expression on his face made it immediately clear that he had no idea what we were talking about when we started excitedly telling him about seeing him outside and playing the chasing game with him. When we explained that we'd been running from him in the woods and that he'd been growling at us and acting scary, Derek's eyes went wide with alarm. He told us immediately to go to the bedroom and stay there while he figured out what was going on. We sat in the bedroom for about 20 minutes, whispering among ourselves and trying to understand what had just happened. Derek eventually came in and told us not to worry, that it had just been him playing around and trying to scare us. He said we should just forget about it and go on with our night, as if nothing unusual had occurred. At the time, we accepted his explanation and didn't think too much more about the incident. Kids are remarkably good at accepting adult explanations and moving on to the next activity without dwelling on things that don't make complete sense. It wasn't until about 3 years later, when I was 13 years old, that Derek finally told me the truth about what had really happened that night. By then, I was old enough to handle more serious and frightening information, and Derek felt I deserved to know what we had actually encountered. He explained that what we had seen in the woods that night was a skinwalker, a shape-shifting entity from Native American folklore that can take on the appearance of humans and animals. He told me that he had dealt with similar encounters when he was around our age, and he proceeded to share his own terrifying story about previous experiences with these creatures. I may share Derek's story someday, depending on how people respond to this account, because his encounters were even more detailed and frightening than what we experienced that night. Derek explained that skinwalkers are known for their ability to perfectly mimic the appearance and behavior of people you know. But there are usually subtle differences that give them away if you know what to look for. They might move in slightly unnatural ways, make sounds that aren't quite right, or appear in places where the real person couldn't logically be. The fact that we had seen Derek outside in the woods, while the real Derek was inside the house sleeping, was a classic example of skinwalker behavior. These entities apparently study their targets and can replicate their appearance convincingly enough to fool people, especially children who aren't looking for discrepancies. What makes this encounter even more unsettling is that skinwalkers are said to be malevolent entities that often have harmful intentions toward the humans they encounter. The fact that it was mimicking Derek someone we trusted completely, suggests that it was trying to lure us deeper into the woods, where we would be more vulnerable and isolated. If Derek hadn't been asleep in the house and available to reveal the truth about what was happening, we might have continued following the fake Derek further into the forest, potentially putting ourselves in serious danger. This experience taught me that not everything in the wilderness is what it appears to be, and that some of the most dangerous encounters can involve things that look completely familiar and trustworthy. It also made me much more cautious about trusting my eyes when I'm in remote areas, especially after dark. This is just one of many strange encounters I've had in and around this particular national park area. And there are definitely more stories I could share about the unusual things that happen when you spend a lot of time in these ancient, mysterious forests. Dr. Michael Martinez's experienced hands paused mid-examination as he lifted the bandage from Rachel Harrison's ankle. In his 15 years as an endocrinologist, he had seen many cases of diabetic complications, but the severity of what lay beneath the dressing still caught him off guard. The infection had progressed far beyond what the initial emergency room notes had indicated. "Nurse, please contact the infectious disease team immediately," he said, his voice maintaining professional calm despite the urgency he felt. The distinctive sweet, sickly odor rising from the wound confirmed his worst suspicions about how long this condition had been developing. "How long has the patient been unconscious?" he asked the attending nurse while reaching for his phone to call the specialist directly. "Almost 8 hours, Dr. Martinez. She was brought in by her assistant after collapsing at work." Dr. Martinez studied Rachel's pale face against the stark white hospital pillow. This woman was fighting for her life, not because of some rare disease, but because of something entirely preventable, something she had chosen to ignore until it nearly destroyed her. Rachel Harrison had built her reputation as one of Manhattan's most successful marketing executives. At 43, she commanded respect in the gleaming offices of Sterling Communications, where her innovative campaigns had generated millions in revenue and earned her a coveted corner office overlooking Central Park. Her designer suits and perfectly styled auburn hair concealed a woman who had been quietly unraveling for years. The divorce 3 years earlier had not been kind to Rachel. Her ex-husband David had left her for his yoga instructor, taking half their assets and leaving her with crushing alimony payments on their Upper East Side apartment. Their son Michael had chosen to attend college on the West Coast, ostensibly for its excellent engineering program. But Rachel suspected he was fleeing the toxic atmosphere that had consumed their home during the lengthy divorce proceedings. Adding to her burden was her younger sister Lisa, who had been diagnosed with early-onset multiple sclerosis at 35. Lisa's condition required constant medical attention and frequent hospitalizations, responsibilities that fell primarily on Rachel's shoulders, since their parents had passed away 5 years earlier. Rachel's days had become a relentless cycle of high-stakes client meetings, late-night strategy sessions, and weekend trips to the rehabilitation center, where Lisa was learning to cope with her progressive disability. Exhaustion had become her constant companion, though she masked it behind a veneer of professional competence and designer coffee. "You're going to burn out if you don't slow down," her assistant Jennifer had warned just 2 months earlier. Rachel had dismissed the concern with her practiced laugh, the same one she used to deflect client complaints and awkward questions about her personal life. What nobody at Sterling Communications knew was that Rachel had been receiving increasingly urgent warnings about her health. During her last physical examination, Dr. Patricia Chen had slid a pamphlet about diabetes across her desk with obvious concern. Your fasting glucose is 135 milligrams per deciliter, Dr. Chen had explained. Normal is below 100. You're in the prediabetic range, and these numbers have been climbing for 2 years. We need to address this immediately. Rachel had tucked the pamphlet into her purse, where it remained buried beneath business cards and lipstick tubes, just as she had buried her concerns about the excessive thirst that had been plaguing her for months, the frequent urination that interrupted her sleep, and the persistent fatigue that no amount of caffeine seemed to cure. The irony was not lost on her that the woman who crafted compelling narratives for million-dollar brands had become the author of her most dangerous fiction. The story that she was fine, that she could handle everything, that her body would somehow adapt to the relentless demands she placed upon it. The first symptoms appeared innocuously enough, as medical emergencies often do. Rachel noticed the initial patches of red, irritated skin around her ankles after returning from a client presentation in Chicago. The itching was mild at first, barely noticeable amid the chaos of her schedule. Probably just dry skin from the hotel, she muttered to herself, applying over-the-counter hydrocortisone cream while reviewing emails on her phone. The bathroom counter in her apartment told the story of a woman too busy to notice warning signs. Unopened vitamin bottles, expired prescription medications, and a blood glucose monitor still in its packaging that Dr. Chen had insisted she purchase months earlier. The morning after the Chicago trip, Rachel woke earlier than usual, her skin feeling tight and uncomfortable. Under the harsh bathroom lighting, she examined the rash more closely. It had definitely spread, creeping up toward her calves like ivy climbing a neglected wall. The hydrocortisone seemed to have helped slightly, reducing the angry redness to a duller pink. Good enough, she declared, having bigger concerns that day. Specifically, the presentation that could finally secure her promotion to senior vice president, a position she had been pursuing for 3 years. During breakfast, her phone buzzed with a text from Michael at Stanford. "Mom, you sounded really tired during our last call. Are you taking care of yourself?" Rachel hesitated before responding. Their relationship had been strained since the divorce, with Michael clearly struggling to understand why his parents' 20-year marriage had imploded so spectacularly. She typed back quickly, "Just busy with work, sweetheart. Nothing I can't handle. Focus on your studies." By midday, the itching had intensified significantly. During a bathroom break between meetings, Rachel examined her ankles again. The rash was definitely spreading, and tiny blisters had begun forming along the edges of the inflamed areas. She applied more cream and pulled her stockings back up, ignoring the burning sensation. Her phone rang as she returned to her office. Lisa, calling from the rehabilitation center. "Rachel, I'm having a bad day." Her sister's voice was thick with frustration. "My hands are acting up again, and I dropped my medication this morning. Can you pick up a new prescription?" Rachel felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. Of course, I'll stop by after work. How are you feeling otherwise? Honestly, scared. The doctor mentioned that my latest MRI shows some progression. I don't want to burden you, but I don't have anyone else to talk to about this. The vulnerability in Lisa's voice cut through Rachel's professional armor. You're not a burden. We'll get through this together. We always do. After hanging up, Rachel stared out her office window at the Manhattan skyline, feeling the weight of everyone's dependence on her. Michael needed her to pay his tuition. Lisa needed her medical and emotional support. Her team at Sterling needed her leadership on the Johnson account that was hemorrhaging clients. Everyone needed her to be strong, capable, unbreakable. That evening, Rachel soaked in a hot bath, hoping to relieve the now constant itching and burning in her legs. The rash had worsened considerably, spreading halfway up her calves, and the blisters had grown larger and more painful. She balanced her laptop precariously on the toilet seat, researching red, itchy rash diabetes, while the warm water provided temporary relief. The search results were concerning, but not alarming enough to derail her immediate plans. Contact dermatitis, fungal infections, bacterial complications of diabetes, all conditions that could presumably be managed with over-the-counter treatments and better hygiene. After the presentation tomorrow, after securing the promotion that would provide financial stability for all of them, she would make time to see a doctor. Sleep proved elusive that night. The burning sensation kept her awake, and when she finally drifted off, she dreamed of drowning in a sea of spreadsheets while her family called for help from the shore. The next morning, Rachel dressed carefully in a navy suit with pants that completely concealed her inflamed skin. She applied extra concealer under her eyes, took 2 antihistamine tablets, and consumed a double espresso to combat the exhaustion that had become her baseline state. The boardroom buzzed with anticipation as the senior partners and potential clients gathered for her presentation. Rachel stood at the head of the polished conference table, her materials perfectly organized, her discomfort hidden behind years of professional training. Our consumer research indicates that the target demographic responds most strongly to authentic storytelling and emotional connection, she began, clicking through her meticulously prepared slides. Was the room slightly warmer than usual, or was she running a fever? Rachel pushed through, her voice never betraying the fire crawling up her legs or the metallic taste that had developed in her mouth. The presentation was flawless. The clients nodded approvingly, the senior partners exchanged satisfied glances, and implementation timelines were discussed enthusiastically. Rachel had secured not just the account, but almost certainly her promotion as well. It wasn't until the meeting dispersed that Rachel felt her strength completely evaporate. She made it to the women's restroom before her legs buckled, barely catching herself on the marble sink counter. In the mirror, she saw a stranger, pale, clammy, with dark circles that no amount of makeup could conceal. "Rachel, are you okay in there?" Jennifer's voice called from outside the locked door. "Fine," Rachel replied automatically, the word as reflexive as breathing. But as she pulled up her pant leg to examine the now weeping blisters, the smell that rose from her infected skin told a very different story. She wasn't fine. She hadn't been fine for a very long time. The restroom door opened despite Rachel's protests. Jennifer's professional composure crumbled as she took in the sight of her boss gripping the sink counter. Mascara, smudged beneath fever-bright eyes. "My God, Rachel, what's happening?" Jennifer rushed forward, supporting Rachel's weight as her knees threatened to give way entirely. "Just a dizzy spell," Rachel attempted to straighten, to reclaim her authority. But the movement sent a wave of nausea through her stomach. The presentation took more out of me than expected. Jennifer's eyes dropped to where Rachel's pant leg had ridden up, revealing the angry, weeping skin beneath. "What is that on your leg? That looks seriously infected." Rachel yanked the fabric down, but the damage was done. "It's just a rash, allergic reaction. I have cream for it." "That is not just a rash." Jennifer's voice took on the authoritative tone Rachel typically used with difficult clients. "That needs immediate medical attention. I'm calling Dr. Peterson's office 3 blocks away." "Absolutely not." Rachel pushed away from the sink, swaying slightly. "I have a follow-up meeting with the Johnson team in 20 minutes. This promotion is everything I've worked toward." Jennifer crossed her arms, unmoved. "The Johnson team can wait. I'll reschedule and tell them you were called to handle a client emergency. But you're seeing a doctor today, or I'm calling 911. 45 minutes later, Rachel sat in an examination room at Manhattan Urgent Care, her stockings discarded and her legs exposed for medical inspection. Dr. Amanda Foster's expression grew increasingly serious as she examined the spreading infection. "How long has this been developing, Ms. Harrison?" she asked, making notes in Rachel's chart. "A few days, maybe a week," Rachel replied, the lie slipping out automatically. Dr. Foster's skeptical gaze met hers. "This level of infection doesn't develop in a few days. Based on the tissue damage and spread pattern, I'd estimate we're looking at 2 to 3 weeks of progression, minimum." Rachel looked away, focusing on a diagram of the human circulatory system mounted on the wall. "I've been busy. It didn't seem serious until recently. I'm very concerned about the possibility of systemic infection," Dr. Foster continued, her voice professional but grave. "The blistering, odor, and spread pattern suggest a serious bacterial infection, possibly complicated by uncontrolled diabetes. Have you been experiencing excessive thirst, frequent urination, or unexplained fatigue?" The precision of her questions caught Rachel off guard. All of those symptoms had been present for months, but she had attributed them to stress, poor sleep, and too much caffeine. "Yes to all of those," she admitted reluctantly, "but I assumed it was work stress. I'm in line for senior vice president at my firm." Dr. Foster set down her clipboard, her expression becoming more serious. "Ms. Harrison, I suspect we're dealing with uncontrolled type 2 diabetes, complicated by a severe skin infection. Elevated glucose levels create an ideal environment for bacterial growth, and your immune system is compromised. We need comprehensive blood work immediately, and you should prepare yourself for the possibility of hospitalization." "Hospitalization?" Rachel's voice cracked with disbelief. "That's impossible. I have client obligations, a presentation tomorrow, and my sister needs me for her medical appointments." "What your sister needs," Dr. Foster interrupted firmly, "is for you to be alive and healthy. This isn't negotiable. If my suspicions are correct, you're at risk for sepsis, which can be fatal." As blood was drawn and cultures taken, Rachel's phone buzzed repeatedly with congratulatory messages from colleagues, a reminder about Lisa's physical therapy appointment, and an unexpected call from Michael. Mom, his voice sounded distant, concerned. Jennifer texted me that you're at the doctor. What's going on? Rachel stared at her phone, thumb hovering over the screen. How could she explain that her neglect of her health might cost him another parent? That history was repeating itself in ways she had never anticipated. Just some routine tests, she replied, hating herself for the deception. Big success at work today. The Johnson presentation went perfectly. Mom, you don't sound right. Your voice is different. Are you really okay? The concern in his voice nearly broke her resolve. I'm handling it, Michael. Don't worry about your old mom. After hanging up, Rachel sat alone in the sterile examination room, surrounded by the medical paraphernalia that had suddenly invaded her carefully controlled life. For the first time since her divorce, she allowed herself to acknowledge the crushing weight of trying to be everything to everyone while ignoring her own needs entirely. Dr. Foster returned with prescriptions and a grave expression. Your preliminary blood work confirms my concerns. Your glucose level is 347 milligrams per deciliter. Normal is below 140 after eating. You're in diabetic crisis territory. Rachel stared at the number, trying to process its significance. What does that mean exactly? It means your body has been under severe metabolic stress for an extended period. The infection has likely been developing for weeks, fed by consistently high blood sugar levels. I'm prescribing immediate insulin therapy, oral antibiotics, and topical treatments. But I want you to understand something clearly. This is a medical emergency. The doctor leaned forward, her voice gentle but unyielding. You can return to work today only to arrange coverage for your responsibilities. After that, you need complete rest for at least 72 hours while we stabilize your condition. If your symptoms worsen, or if you develop fever, confusion, or increased pain, you need to come to the emergency room immediately. Jennifer was waiting in the reception area, her face etched with worry. What's the verdict? Nothing serious, Rachel lied, tucking the prescriptions into her purse. Just need to take some medication and get more rest. In the taxi back to the office, Jennifer studied her boss's profile with obvious skepticism. You know, my mother was exactly like you. Never admitted when something was wrong until she collapsed at my wedding. Turned out she'd been ignoring stage 3 breast cancer symptoms for 8 months. Rachel turned to stare out the window, unwilling to meet Jennifer's knowing gaze. What happened? We got 18 more months with her. Jennifer's voice was gentle but pointed. Could have been years if she'd gotten treatment sooner. Whatever that doctor told you, Rachel, please take it seriously. The Johnson account isn't worth your life. That evening, alone in her apartment bathroom, Rachel stared at the collection of medications Dr. Foster had prescribed. Insulin pens, blood glucose test strips, antibiotic tablets, antifungal cream, and detailed instructions that read like a foreign language. The reality of her situation began to penetrate the walls of denial she had constructed around her health. With shaking hands, she pricked her finger and placed a drop of blood on the test strip. The glucose meter beeped, displaying a number that seemed impossible, 362 milligrams per deciliter, even higher than the doctor's office reading. Rachel sank to the bathroom floor, the cold tile grounding her as the room seemed to spin around her. For the first time since her divorce, she allowed herself to cry. Not the controlled tears she had permitted at appropriate moments, but raw, gasping sobs that echoed off the bathroom walls. She had spent 3 years building a life focused on everyone else's needs, while ignoring her own body's desperate pleas for attention. Now that carefully constructed existence was threatening to collapse just as she had reached the professional summit she had been climbing toward. The morning after her diagnosis, Rachel woke to persistent buzzing from her phone. Through blurry eyes, she read the display, Dr. Foster's office. The blood work results were available earlier than expected. Ms. Harrison, this is Dr. Michael Martinez. I'm an endocrinologist, and Dr. Foster has asked me to consult on your case. The voice was deep and authoritative, with an undercurrent of concern that immediately put Rachel on high alert. How quickly can you come in this morning? Your blood work shows some values that require immediate attention. 2 hours later, Rachel sat across from Dr. Martinez in his office, taking in the medical degrees on the wall and the family photos arranged neatly on his desk. There was something reassuring about his calm demeanor, though his words were anything but comforting. Your hemoglobin A1C is 11.8%, he explained, referring to the test that measures average blood sugar over 3 months. Normal is below 5.7%. Anything above 6.5 indicates diabetes. You're well into the danger zone. Rachel stared at the charts he had placed before her, the numbers and medical terminology creating a picture she was only beginning to understand. So what's the treatment plan? More medications. I have a company to run and family responsibilities. Dr. Martinez leaned forward, his expression serious but compassionate. What you have, Rachel, is a medical emergency that requires your complete attention. I'm recommending immediate hospitalization to stabilize your glucose levels and treat the infection with intravenous antibiotics. That's not possible, Rachel protested. I can manage the medications at home. I have too many people depending on me. The infection cultures confirm an aggressive bacterial strain that's established itself in your tissue. Dr. Martinez continued, ignoring her protests. Your diabetes has compromised your immune system, creating perfect conditions for this type of severe infection. Without proper treatment, you're at risk for sepsis, possible amputation, or worse. The word amputation hit Rachel like a physical blow. She stared at him in shock, her mind struggling to process the possibility of losing parts of herself she had never even considered fragile. How long would hospitalization take? She asked finally. Initial stabilization would require 3 to 5 days, possibly longer depending on how quickly the infection responds to treatment. Rachel thought of Lisa, who would be confused and frightened by any disruption to her routine, of Michael, who was already worried about her health, of the Johnson account that needed her personal attention. I need 24 hours, she said finally, to arrange care for my sister and delegate critical projects at work. Then I'll check myself in. Dr. Martinez studied her carefully, clearly weighing whether to push harder for immediate admission. 24 hours, not a minute more. And you start the insulin regimen immediately, along with all the prescribed medications. Any fever, increased pain, or confusion, and you call me immediately or go to the emergency room. Are we clear? Rachel nodded, already mentally composing emails to her team and calls to Lisa's medical support network. The rest of the day became an exercise in delegation and careful deception. She arranged for extended nursing care for Lisa, telling her sister she needed to attend a week-long conference in Los Angeles. She emailed her team about working remotely due to a minor health issue requiring rest. Avoiding Catherine's increasingly concerned texts asking for updates about her doctor's visit. By evening, Rachel was exhausted, her skin burning with infection, her mind foggy despite the insulin beginning to lower her blood sugar levels. She sat at her kitchen table, medical supplies spread before her like alien artifacts. Alcohol swabs, insulin pens, glucose tablets, pill organizers. The paraphernalia of chronic illness that had suddenly invaded her carefully controlled life. Her phone rang. Michael. Mom, Jennifer told me you went to the doctor today. What's really going on? And don't tell me it's nothing because I can hear it in your voice. Rachel closed her eyes, knowing she couldn't lie to him anymore. I've been diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, and I have a related skin infection. I'm checking into the hospital tomorrow to get things stabilized. I'm coming home, Michael said immediately. I can catch a red-eye tonight. No, Michael, you have finals next week. I'll be fine. Don't lie to me, his voice cracked with emotion. Not about this. I can't lose you too. The reference to his father's death in a car accident 2 years before the divorce hung between them, unspoken but understood. David had also been someone who ignored health warnings, who insisted he was fine right up until the moment he wasn't. I'm scared, Rachel whispered, the admission costing her more than any business negotiation ever had. I know, Mom, I'm booking a flight now. I'll be there tomorrow. After hanging up, Rachel dragged herself to her home office to finish preparing transition documents for her team. The computer screen blurred before her eyes as fever and fatigue took their toll. Opening her email, she found a message from Dr. Martinez with detailed instructions and his personal cell phone number. As she scrolled through the medical directives, a wave of dizziness washed over her. The room tilted dangerously, and the computer screen became a smear of light. Rachel reached for her phone, Dr. Martinez's warning about confusion echoing in her mind, but her coordination failed her. The phone clattered to the floor as darkness claimed her consciousness. She dreamed of David, not as the bitter, unfaithful man who had left her, but as the concerned husband he had been in their early years together. He was trying to tell her something important, his face serious with worry, but no sound emerged from his moving lips. She strained to hear, desperate for his message, but could only make out fragments. Should have listened. Still time. Don't be stubborn. Rachel woke to harsh fluorescent lights and the steady beep of hospital monitors. The transition from unconsciousness to awareness was gradual, her mind feeling wrapped in cotton, thoughts coming slowly through a haze of medication and confusion. She's awake, a nurse's voice announced, followed by movement around her bed. Dr. Martinez's face appeared above her, concern etched in the lines around his dark eyes. Welcome back, Rachel. You gave us quite a scare. How did I get here? Her voice was barely a whisper, her throat painfully dry. Your neighbor heard a crash from your apartment and used the spare key you'd given her for emergencies. She found you unconscious in your office. You've been here for almost 36 hours. The information felt surreal, like hearing about someone else's life. 36 hours lost. Lisa must be frantic with worry. Her team would be scrambling to cover her responsibilities. My son, Michael, arrived yesterday evening. He's getting coffee and should be back any minute. Your sister is being cared for by the extended nursing service you arranged." Relief and shame warred within Rachel. Michael had seen her like this, vulnerable and failing, after years of maintaining the facade of the invincible mother. "How bad is it?" she asked, gesturing weakly to her legs, which were elevated and wrapped in sterile dressings. Dr. Martinez's expression grew grave. "The infection progressed significantly while you were unconscious. We've started aggressive intravenous antibiotic therapy and insulin drips. Your blood sugar peaked at over 400 milligrams per deciliter, which is life-threatening territory. Am I going to lose my legs?" The question emerged bluntly, born of the same directness that had served her well in boardrooms and client meetings. "We're doing everything possible to prevent that," Dr. Martinez replied carefully. "The next 72 hours will be critical. The infection had a substantial head start, but we're seeing some encouraging signs." The door opened and Michael appeared, coffee cup in hand. He froze at the sight of his mother awake, their eyes meeting across the sterile hospital room. 3 years of careful distance, of surface conversations and avoided topics, evaporated in that moment. "Mom," he rushed forward, coffee forgotten on the bedside table. "You're awake, thank God." Rachel took in her son's appearance. Hair disheveled, dark circles under eyes red with exhaustion, wearing what were clearly yesterday's clothes. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the inadequacy of the words burning her throat. "Don't apologize, just fight. I can't lose you." Dr. Martinez discreetly stepped out, leaving mother and son to their reunion. Michael pulled a chair close to the bed, never releasing Rachel's hand. "Lisa sends her love," he said, his voice steady despite the fear evident in his eyes. "Jennifer has been amazing, coordinating everything at work. The doctors say the next few days will be tough, but they're optimistic if you follow the treatment protocol exactly." Rachel studied her son's face, seeing the man he had become during their years of emotional distance. "When did you become so grown up?" Michael's laugh was watery. "Somewhere between Dad's death and watching, you work yourself nearly to death trying to take care of everyone except yourself." The brutal honesty hung between them, not accusatory, but plainly stating the reality they had both been avoiding. "I thought I was protecting you," Rachel admitted. "From the stress, from the financial pressure, from seeing me struggle. I didn't need protection, Mom. I needed honesty. I needed you to let me help instead of shutting me out." The monitors beeped steadily as Rachel absorbed her son's words. The fortress she had built around her vulnerability had been intended as protection, but had instead become a prison that isolated her from the people who loved her most. "The doctors say you might need surgery," Michael continued gently, "to remove infected tissue, but they think they can save your legs if the antibiotics work." Rachel nodded, feeling a strange sense of relief at having the truth finally spoken aloud. No more pretending, no more managing everyone else's perceptions of her strength. The next few days passed in a blur of medical interventions, uncomfortable treatments, and long conversations that began to bridge the chasm years of avoidance had created. Jennifer visited daily, bringing not only work updates, but personal touches. Magazine articles Rachel enjoyed, flowers from her office, and updates from colleagues who were genuinely concerned about her recovery. Lisa was brought for a brief visit, her condition stable enough to understand that her sister was seriously ill. "You work too hard," Lisa said, patting Rachel's hand with one of her functioning fingers. Just like Dad did, he worried himself into that heart attack. The comparison to their father struck Rachel with unexpected force. She came from a family that measured worth through productivity, that saw vulnerability as weakness, that pushed through warning signs until their bodies finally rebelled in dramatic fashion. Dr. Martinez monitored her progress closely, his steady presence providing unexpected comfort. Rachel found herself looking forward to his visits, not just for medical updates, but for the calm competence he brought to her chaotic new reality. "Your blood glucose is stabilizing nicely," he reported on the fourth day. "And the infection is responding to treatment, though more slowly than I'd like." "What's the realistic prognosis?" Rachel asked, having learned to demand unvarnished truth from her medical team. "Cautiously optimistic. The tissue damage around your ankles is significant, but the spread has halted. We may need to consider surgical debridement to remove dead tissue, but I believe we can avoid amputation if this positive trend continues." Michael, who had barely left her side except for brief trips home to shower and change clothes, asked the questions Rachel couldn't bring herself to voice. About long-term management, potential complications, and what life would look like after discharge. "You mentioned surgical debridement," Rachel said, interrupting a technical discussion about medication interactions. "When would that happen?" "Within the next 48 hours, if we decide to proceed. I'd like to give the antibiotics more time, but we can't wait indefinitely." Rachel made a decision that surprised even herself. "Do it tomorrow. I'm tired of waiting, of hoping things will improve on their own. That's what got me here in the first place." Dr. Martinez studied her with what looked like approval. "That's decisive thinking. Sometimes the most aggressive treatment path is actually the safest one in the long run." That night, alone with Michael, after the nurses had completed their evening rounds, Rachel reached for her son's hand. "There's something I need to tell you about your father's accident." Michael stiffened, his expression cautious. "What about it?" "It might not have been just an accident." Rachel's voice was barely above a whisper. "He'd been having symptoms for months before he died. Chest pain, shortness of breath, fatigue that he couldn't shake. I made doctor's appointments that he canceled. I bought him aspirin and told him to take it daily. But I found the bottle still full after he died." The confession hung in the air between them. Years of guilt finally given voice. "You think he had a heart attack while driving?" Michael said, his medical school knowledge connecting the dots. Rachel nodded, tears tracking silently down her face. "The police said he'd crossed the median for no apparent reason. No skid marks, no attempt to correct. I never told anyone, not the investigators, not the insurance company. I couldn't admit that I'd failed to make him take care of himself." Michael's face reflected not anger, but profound sadness. "So instead, you punished yourself by doing exactly what he did, ignoring your health until it nearly killed you." The pattern, laid out so plainly, was undeniable. Rachel had been unconsciously following David's path, as if joining him in neglecting her health would somehow atone for her failure to save him. "I don't want to do that anymore," Rachel whispered. "I want to live, really live, not just survive." Michael leaned forward, pressing his forehead against their clasped hands. "Then that's what we'll do, together." The operating room was colder than Rachel had expected. As the orderlies transferred her from the gurney to the surgical table, she fought against the instinct to shiver. to show fear. The bright lights overhead cast everything in stark relief. Gleaming instruments, masked faces of the surgical team, Dr. Martinez's calm eyes above his surgical mask. "We're going to take excellent care of you, Rachel," he said, his voice steady and reassuring. "The procedure should take about 90 minutes. When you wake up, the worst of the infected tissue will be gone, and we'll be well on our way to complete healing." Rachel nodded, unable to form words past the knot of anxiety in her throat. As the anesthesiologist prepared the medication that would send her into unconsciousness, she thought of Michael in the waiting room, of Lisa being cared for at home, of the fragile network of relationships she had nearly severed through her stubborn self-reliance. "I need you to count backward from 10, the anesthesiologist instructed, inserting the IV line. 10, 9, 8. Rachel's voice seemed to come from far away, and by 7, darkness had claimed her. She dreamed of David again, but this time he wasn't trying to speak. Instead, he was simply present, sitting beside her on the deck of their old house, the one they had shared before everything went wrong. In the dream, he looked healthy and at peace, the way he had appeared before the stress of their marriage had begun to consume him. "I miss you," Rachel told him, the simplicity of dream logic allowing her to speak directly. David smiled, the expression crinkling the corners of his eyes in the way that had first attracted her to him 25 years earlier. "I know, but you have so much left to do. Michael needs you, but not the perfect, untouchable version you've been trying to be. He needs the real you." The dream shifted, and suddenly they were standing in Michael's dorm room, watching their son hunched over textbooks, his young face drawn with worry and grief. "He's been carrying so much," David said. "Your fear, Lisa's illness, the family's financial pressure. You were trying to protect him, but you ended up isolating him instead." Rachel reached toward Michael, but her hand passed through his form like smoke. "I don't know how to be vulnerable. I don't know how to need people." "Yes, you do." David's voice was fading as the dream began to unravel. "You always have, you just forgot." Rachel woke to the disorienting half-light of the recovery room, the dream clinging to her consciousness like morning fog. Pain radiated from her legs, but it was different now. Sharp and clean, rather than the burning, infected agony she had endured for weeks. A nurse noticed her stirring and approached, checking monitors, and adjusting her pain medication with practiced efficiency. "Dr. Martinez will be in shortly," the nurse informed her. "The procedure went very well. Your son has been notified, and he'll be allowed to visit once you're moved back to your room." Time seemed to stretch and compress in the post-anesthesia haze. Rachel drifted between consciousness and sleep, fragments of her dream mingling with the sounds and sensations of recovery. When she next opened her eyes fully, she was back in her familiar hospital room. Michael sat beside the bed, reading a medical journal, his face lined with the particular exhaustion that comes from days of vigilant worry. "Hey," he said, setting aside the journal. "How's the pain?" "Manageable," Rachel replied, her voice raspy but functional. "What did Dr. Martinez say about the surgery?" Michael's expression told her everything before he spoke. It was more extensive than they initially expected. The infection had penetrated deeper than the scans showed. They had to remove significant tissue from both ankles. Rachel closed her eyes, absorbing the news. "But they saved my legs." "Yes," Michael confirmed, squeezing her hand. "But the recovery will be longer and more complicated than we hoped." physical therapy, wound care, continued medication management. You won't be returning to your normal schedule anytime soon. The old Rachel would have immediately begun calculating how to work around these limitations, how to maintain her professional momentum despite physical setbacks. Instead, she found herself wondering if her corner office would feel like a prison when she eventually returned. Jennifer called, Michael continued, watching his mother's face carefully. The partners are arranging temporary coverage of your accounts. They sent flowers. He gestured to an elaborate arrangement by the window. Everyone's been really supportive. Rachel nodded, unexpectedly moved by the thought of her colleagues rallying around her absence. People she had kept at arm's length for years were now stepping forward without hesitation. The door opened and Dr. Martinez entered, looking tired but satisfied as he consulted her chart. "Good, you're fully awake. How are you feeling?" "Like someone took a scalpel to my legs," Rachel replied dryly, earning a small smile from the doctor. "Accurate assessment. The debridement was more extensive than we'd hoped, but absolutely necessary. We removed all visibly infected tissue and sent samples for additional culture and sensitivity testing." He moved to examine the bandaged areas, his touch professional but gentle. "The good news is that the remaining tissue looks healthy, and your latest blood work shows glucose levels continuing to stabilize." "When can I go home?" Rachel asked. The question automatic, though she already suspected the answer wouldn't be what she wanted to hear. Dr. Martinez's expression turned serious. "Not for at least another week, possibly longer. You'll need daily wound care and continued intravenous antibiotics. And when you do go home, you'll need assistance. This isn't something you can manage alone, Rachel." The implications of his words sank in slowly. Complete dependency, vulnerability, needs she couldn't meet through determination or intelligence alone. The fortress of self-sufficiency she had built over years was crumbling in the face of physical reality. "I'll be staying through the summer," Michael announced firmly, answering the question Rachel hadn't voiced. "I've already spoken with my professors about completing my coursework remotely." "Your education," Rachel began to protest. "Is important," Michael finished. "But so are you. I'm not making the same mistake we made with Dad." Dr. Martinez nodded approvingly. "I'll have our wound care specialists begin training both of you on the procedures you'll eventually need to perform at home. Our diabetes educators will work with you on long-term management strategies. This is going to be a significant lifestyle change." After he left, silence settled between mother and son, heavy with unspoken fears and adjustments yet to be made. Rachel stared at the ceiling, trying to reconcile the independent woman she had been just days ago with the patient she now was, dependent on others for the most basic needs. "It's okay to be scared," Michael said finally. "I am too." Rachel turned to look at her son, seeing not the child she had protected, but the man who was now preparing to care for her. "When did we switch places?" Michael's smile was sad but genuine. "We haven't. We're just finally on the same team again." The next several days passed in a blur of medical procedures, pain management, and increasingly concerning updates from the outside world. The Johnson account was facing challenges without Rachel's direct oversight. Lisa had experienced another episode requiring medication adjustments and additional nursing support. The medical bills were beginning to arrive, stark reminders of the financial implications of serious illness. even with comprehensive insurance. On the fourth morning after surgery, Rachel woke from fitful sleep to find not Michael, but Jennifer sitting beside her bed, laptop open on her knees. "Morning, boss," Jennifer greeted her, setting the computer aside. "Hope you don't mind the intrusion. Michael went home to shower and check on some things. He gave me his visitor's pass." Rachel blinked, disoriented by the collision of her professional and medical worlds. "What are you doing here so early?" "Damage control," Jennifer replied bluntly. "The Johnson team is threatening to reassign their business if we don't provide clearer direction. Henderson is making noises about permanently redistributing your client portfolio, and the quarterly projections are due Monday." The familiar pressure of work deadlines settled on Rachel's chest, momentarily overshadowing her physical pain. "I need to call them, explain the situation." "You need to rest and recover," Jennifer interrupted. "I didn't come here to stress you out. I came to get your authorization to handle things my way until you're back on your feet." Rachel studied her assistant's face, seeing determination and competence where she had always before noticed only efficiency and compliance. "Your way." Jennifer nodded confidently. "I've been watching you build client relationships for 5 years. I understand your strategies, your approach to problem solving. I can keep the plates spinning, but I need official authority to make decisions in your absence. The partners have already signed off on it. The official line is that you're on medical leave for at least 6 weeks. The reality may be longer." 6 weeks. The time frame landed like a physical blow. Rachel had never taken more than a long weekend away from work since her divorce. Even during David's funeral arrangements, she had been fielding calls and emails during quiet moments. "What if I can't come back?" The question emerged unbidden, giving voice to her deepest fear. "What if this changes everything permanently?" Jennifer's expression softened with genuine compassion. "Then it changes everything, and we adapt. But right now, I need you to trust me to protect what you've built while you focus on getting better." Trust. The concept had become almost foreign to Rachel, who had spent years believing that relying on others was a weakness she couldn't afford. Yet here she was, utterly dependent on medical professionals for her survival, on Michael for her care, on Jennifer for her professional legacy. "Okay," Rachel said finally. "You have full authority to act on my behalf. Just keep me informed where you can." Jennifer nodded, visibly relieved. "I will. And Rachel, the partners aren't just being supportive for appearances. They genuinely understand your value. You've been the backbone of that place for 12 years. They know it won't be the same without you." After Jennifer left, Rachel lay awake staring at the ceiling tiles, counting the small imperfections as a distraction from the pain pulsing through her legs. The medication dulled it, but couldn't eliminate it entirely. A constant reminder of how close she had come to losing not just her mobility, but her life. Dr. Martinez's arrival interrupted her thoughts. He was accompanied by a full team of specialists: the wound care nurse, the diabetes educator, a physical therapist, and surprisingly, a psychologist. "Good morning, Rachel. Today we're going to review your comprehensive care plan," Dr. Martinez began, his tone more formal in front of the assembled team. "Each of these professionals will play a crucial role in your recovery process. As the specialists outlined treatment protocols, therapy regimens, and psychological support strategies, the enormity of her condition finally registered fully. This wasn't a temporary setback to be overcome through willpower and determination. This was a fundamental reordering of her existence, a new reality that would require her complete acceptance and cooperation. When the team finished their presentations and filed out, Dr. Martinez remained behind, taking the chair beside her bed that had become Michael's usual post. "That was overwhelming," he acknowledged. "How are you processing all of this information?" Rachel laughed hollowly. "I'm not sure I am. Yesterday I was worried about quarterly projections. Now I'm wondering if I'll ever walk normally again. The human body has remarkable capacity for adaptation and healing," Dr. Martinez said, his voice compassionate but realistic. "But recovery isn't just physical. The patients who thrive are those who accept their new reality and work within it, rather than fighting against it constantly. I've spent my entire adult life fighting against limitations," Rachel admitted. "I'm not sure I know how to live any other way." "Then perhaps this is an opportunity to learn something new about yourself," he said gently. "Some of my patients find that a serious health crisis becomes a dividing line in their lives, before and after. The after doesn't have to be worse than the before, just different." 3 weeks after her surgery, Rachel faced what would prove to be the most challenging day of her recovery. The morning had begun with a grueling physical therapy session that left her sweating and trembling with exertion. The simple act of standing with assistance was now a monumental achievement, requiring every ounce of her concentration and will. Her therapist, Brenda, a no-nonsense woman with arms like steel cables, had pushed her harder than ever before, insisting she take 5 steps with the parallel bars before allowing her to rest. "You're babying yourself," Brenda had said bluntly when Rachel protested about the pain. "The tissue is healing well. Discomfort doesn't always indicate damage. Now let's try again." Back in her hospital room, Rachel waited for Michael to arrive with Lisa for their weekly visit. These supervised encounters had become a source of both comfort and distress. Comfort in seeing her sister, distress in witnessing Lisa's accelerating decline. Each visit, Lisa seemed less present, more confused about why her sister was in a hospital bed with bandaged legs. The door opened and Michael entered, guiding Lisa with gentle hands. Today Lisa wore a blue sweater Rachel didn't recognize, her thinning hair neatly styled, a touch of lipstick brightening her pale complexion. Michael's attempts to maintain his aunt's dignity, despite the increasingly difficult morning routines, were evident in these small details. "Look who's here to see you, Aunt Rachel," Michael announced with forced cheerfulness. Lisa's eyes roamed the room, settling briefly on Rachel before sliding away again with confusion. "Is this where you work now, dear? It's very white and clean." Rachel exchanged a glance with Michael, reading the resignation in his expression. "Another difficult day." "No, Lisa, I'm a patient here. Remember, I got sick and needed surgery." Lisa nodded vaguely, allowing Michael to guide her to the chair beside the bed. "Everyone gets sick sometimes. I get sick all the time now. The doctors say it's something in my brain, but I feel fine most days." The casual observation about her multiple sclerosis struck Rachel with unexpected force. Lisa had always been the fragile one in the family, dealing with one health issue after another since childhood. Rachel had prided herself on being different, stronger, more resilient. Now she wondered if she had simply been lucky for longer than most. "How are you feeling today, Lisa?" Michael asked gently, trying to anchor his aunt in the present moment. "Oh, I'm managing," Lisa replied, her lucidity flickering like a candle in wind. "Though I worry about Rachel working too much. She never takes care of herself, just like our father. He worked himself to death, you know." Michael caught Rachel's eye, this silent communication between them becoming more intuitive with each passing day of shared caregiving responsibilities. Should they correct Lisa's confusion about Rachel's condition, or simply go with it? "Actually, Rachel's learning to take better care of herself now," Michael said carefully. "The doctors are helping her understand how to manage her health better." Lisa nodded sagely. Doctors, so many doctors these days. Her gaze suddenly sharpened, focusing on Rachel with unexpected clarity. "They didn't help our father, though, did they? He was gone before they could even try. Heart attack at 58. Too proud to admit he needed help." The room fell silent, both Rachel and Michael frozen by Lisa's unexpected moment of lucidity and the painful accuracy of her observation. In the months since Lisa's condition had worsened, she rarely mentioned their father by name, his existence seemingly erased by her deteriorating memory. "No, Lisa," Rachel finally answered, her voice thick with emotion. "They didn't get the chance to help him." Lisa leaned forward, her frail hand gripping Rachel's with surprising strength. "He was sick longer than he told anyone. I saw it. Sisters always see." Her eyes, briefly clear and knowing, bore into Rachel's. "You're the same, hiding, pretending, but you're getting help now. That's good." Michael made a small sound, something between a gasp and a sob of recognition. Rachel couldn't look at him, couldn't face the truth of her sister's words laid bare so plainly. "I'm trying to be better, Lisa," Rachel whispered. Lisa nodded, apparently satisfied. Then, just as quickly, the moment of clarity vanished. She looked around the room in confusion. "Is it lunchtime? I'm hungry, but I can't remember if I ate breakfast." The visit continued with Lisa drifting in and out of awareness, occasionally making observations of startling insight between long stretches of confusion. When the nurse arrived to take Lisa back to her care facility, Rachel felt the familiar guilt of relief mingled with profound sadness. After they left, Rachel remained silent, processing her sister's unexpected moment of clarity. Michael busied himself straightening the room, adjusting flowers, organizing the ever-growing collection of get-well cards from colleagues and clients. Activities that allowed him to avoid the conversation hanging between them. "She was right," Rachel said finally. "I am just like him, just like Dad, the worst parts of both of them." Michael abandoned his tidying and sat on the edge of the bed. "And the best parts too. Dad's intelligence and drive, Lisa's compassion and attention to detail. You were always the perfect combination of the family strengths. And now I'm falling apart just like they did." Rachel gestured to her bandaged legs, to the insulin pump now attached to her abdomen, to the daily medications lined up on her bedside table. Dad with his heart attack at 58, Lisa with her autoimmune disease, me with diabetes and infection. "You're not falling apart," Michael insisted firmly. "You're healing. There's a crucial difference between breaking down and breaking open." Before Rachel could respond, Dr. Martinez knocked and entered, carrying her latest test results. His expression was more serious than usual, immediately setting Rachel on edge. "What's wrong?" she asked, not bothering with pleasantries. "The latest cultures from your wound sites show a new bacterial strain developing alongside the original infection," he explained, pulling up a chair. It's not uncommon with extensive wounds like yours, but it does complicate our treatment approach significantly. Michael, slipping effortlessly into his pre-med student knowledge, asked, "What organism are we dealing with? Is it responding to the current antibiotic regimen? Pseudomonas aeruginosa?" And unfortunately, no, it's showing resistance to our first-line treatments, Dr. Martinez replied. "We need to adjust your antibiotic protocol immediately and possibly consider another, more targeted surgical debridement if the infection doesn't respond quickly. Another surgery, more tissue removed." The implications struck Rachel like physical blows. "And if that doesn't work?" she asked, though she already knew the answer from his hesitation. "Then we may need to discuss more dramatic interventions to prevent systemic sepsis," Dr. Martinez said carefully. "You mean amputation," Rachel said flatly, naming the fear that had haunted her since her initial diagnosis. "That would be an absolute last resort, but yes, it remains a possibility we need to be prepared for." His professional demeanor softened. "I'm sorry, Rachel. I know this isn't what you wanted to hear." Michael's hand found Rachel's, squeezing tightly. "What's the timeline? How quickly do we need to make these decisions?" "We'll start the new antibiotic protocol immediately. If we don't see significant improvement within 72 hours, we'll need to move forward with additional surgery. The surgical team is on standby." After Dr. Martinez left, silence engulfed the room like a heavy blanket. Rachel stared unseeing at the ceiling, mentally tracing the familiar water stain that resembled a bird in flight. 3 weeks of pain, of humiliating dependence, of grueling therapy sessions, all potentially for nothing. "I can't do this anymore," she whispered. Michael shifted closer. "Can't do what?" "Any of it, the surgeries, the uncertainty, the not knowing. The constant fear of disappointing everyone who's counting on me." "You haven't disappointed anyone," Michael insisted. "You got sick. That's not a moral failing." "Isn't it?" Rachel turned to face her son, no longer bothering to hide the tears that had been threatening all day. "I ignored symptoms for months. I prioritized work over health until my body simply couldn't compensate anymore. That was a choice, Michael. Maybe not a conscious one, but a choice nonetheless." Michael was quiet for a long moment, considering her words carefully. "Dad used to say that you could convince yourself of anything if you tried hard enough. That your superpower was your ability to believe your own narrative, even when it was destroying you." The observation, so accurate it was almost cruel, startled a laugh from Rachel. "He knew me too well." "He did, and he loved you anyway." Michael's expression turned serious. "I do too, which is why I'm not going to let you give up now. I might lose my legs, Michael." The possibility, spoken aloud for the first time, hung between them like a physical presence. "And if you do, we'll deal with that too." Michael's certainty was staggering. "But right now, right this minute, you have 2 choices, fight or surrender. And I've never known Rachel Harrison to surrender anything without one hell of a battle." The echo of David's determination in their son's voice broke something open inside Rachel. A dam holding back years of suppressed grief, fear, and exhaustion burst without warning. The sobs came violently, tearing through her with physical force that left her gasping. Michael held her through the storm, his own tears falling silently as he absorbed his mother's pain and terror. When the worst had passed, leaving Rachel drained but somehow lighter, Michael handed her tissues from the bedside table. "Better?" he asked gently. Not really, Rachel managed a watery smile, but maybe more honest. Honesty is a good place to start. That night, after Michael had gone home to rest and prepare for another day of vigil, Rachel lay awake in the darkened hospital room. The weight of her situation pressed down on her chest, making each breath a conscious effort. The seizure of her legs, of her independence, of her carefully constructed identity, loomed like shadows in the corners of her vision. For the first time in her adult life, Rachel allowed herself to feel the full magnitude of her fear, without immediately strategizing a way to overcome it or bury it beneath work and responsibilities. She let the emotions wash through her. Grief for what she had already lost, terror of what might still be taken, anger at her own stubborn neglect. And beneath it all, surprisingly, a flicker of determination that felt different from her usual drive to achieve and control. This wasn't about conquering her circumstances or forcing her body to comply with her will. This was about showing up fully for whatever came next, whether that meant learning to walk again or learning to live without the legs that had carried her through 43 years of life. If her body was failing her, perhaps it was because she had failed it first. Years of ignoring its signals, of pushing beyond reasonable limits, of treating it as merely the machinery that transported her brain from meeting to meeting and crisis to crisis. The realization came not as a condemnation, but as a simple truth. She had never truly inhabited her physical self, always living in the realm of intellect and achievement, while treating her body as an inconvenient afterthought. As dawn broke, painting the hospital room in pale gold light, Rachel reached a decision that surprised her with its clarity. Whatever happened in the coming days, whether she kept her legs or lost them, whether she returned to her career or had to reinvent herself entirely, she would no longer live divided against herself. Body, mind, heart, and spirit all deserved equal care and attention. It wasn't surrender. It was, perhaps for the first time in her life, truly showing up for the fight that mattered most, the fight for her whole, integrated self. The new antibiotics coursed through Rachel's veins with a potency that was evident in how they made her stomach churn and her head throb. 60 hours into the 72-hour window Dr. Martinez had established, she lay awake at 3 in the morning, listening to the night sounds of the hospital. Distant voices, the squeak of rubber-soled shoes on linoleum, the rhythmic beeping of monitors throughout the ward. Sleep eluded her, chased away by the constant gnawing fear that tomorrow would bring news of treatment failure, of infections spreading despite the most aggressive medical intervention available. A soft knock interrupted her dark thoughts. The door opened to reveal Dr. Martinez, still in surgical scrubs despite the late hour. "You're awake," he observed, stepping into the dimly lit room. "I just finished an emergency surgery and saw your light was on." Rachel shifted carefully, mindful of the IV lines and her still tender surgical sites. "Can't sleep, too much thinking." Dr. Martinez nodded with understanding. "Mind if I check your surgical sites while I'm here? Save the nursing staff a wake-up call." She nodded, watching as he donned gloves and gently unwrapped the bandages. His face revealed nothing as he examined the wound sites, his touch clinical but careful. "Any changes?" Rachel asked, unable to bear the suspense. "The erythema appears slightly reduced around the periphery," he said cautiously. "And there's less purulent drainage than yesterday. Promising signs, but not definitive yet. Rachel released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. So we won't know for certain until tomorrow. That's correct. He rewrapped her legs with practiced efficiency, then surprised her by settling into the visitor's chair instead of leaving immediately. Want to talk about what's keeping you awake? The unexpected offer caught Rachel off guard. In the weeks of her hospitalization, their interactions had gradually shifted from purely professional to something warmer, more personal, but always within appropriate boundaries. This late-night conversation felt like crossing a subtle line into genuine friendship. I keep thinking about what happens if the antibiotics fail, she admitted. About waking up from surgery missing parts of myself that I've never even thought about losing. Dr. Martinez nodded, his expression somber in the dim light. It's a legitimate fear. I won't insult you by dismissing it. I'm not afraid of dying, Rachel continued, the darkness and late hour making honesty easier. I'm afraid of living diminished, of becoming a burden to Michael, of never returning to the work that's defined me for so long, of spending the rest of my life characterized by what I've lost rather than what I am. Understandable, Dr. Martinez leaned forward, elbows on his knees. But in my 15 years of practice, I've learned something about loss and identity. The patients who struggle most aren't necessarily those who lose limbs or function. They're the ones who can't separate their worth from their capabilities. His words struck uncomfortably close to home, hitting the exact fear Rachel had been unable to articulate even to herself. Easy to say when you haven't experienced it, she replied, more defensively than she intended. Actually, I have. Dr. Martinez rolled up his left sleeve, revealing a prosthetic hand so naturally crafted that Rachel hadn't noticed it during their weeks of interaction. Motorcycle accident during my residency. Crushed my dominant hand beyond any possibility of reconstruction. Rachel stared, momentarily speechless. I had no idea. Most people don't, unless I specifically tell them. Not because I hide it, but because I don't define myself by it. He flexed the prosthetic fingers in a surprisingly natural movement. I had to relearn everything. Surgical techniques, daily tasks, even how to hold my daughter when she was born 2 years later. It was hell, but it wasn't the end of my story. The revelation transformed him in Rachel's eyes. From caregiver to fellow traveler on a difficult road, she was only beginning to understand. How did you do it? She asked. Move forward without bitterness or constant resentment. Dr. Martinez considered the question, his face thoughtful in the dim lighting. I stopped asking why me and started asking what now. The first question has no answer that brings peace or resolution. The second opens doors to possibilities you never considered. They talked until dawn began to lighten the sky outside her window. About adaptation and grief, about his family and her career ambitions, about the strange parallel paths that had brought them from their separate struggles to this hospital room, where healing was possible, but not guaranteed. When he finally stood to leave, Rachel felt a curious lightness despite the serious nature of their conversation, and the uncertainty still facing her. Thank you, she said simply, for sharing your story, for seeing me as more than just a difficult case with complicated medical needs. His smile held warmth that transcended their professional relationship. Get some rest, Rachel. Tomorrow's another day in the fight, and you'll need your strength. After he left, Rachel drifted into the first peaceful sleep she had experienced since her admission. She woke to find Michael already in the room, reviewing her chart with the intensity of a medical student preparing for comprehensive exams. "Morning, Mom," he said, setting aside the clipboard. "Dr. Martinez's team is on their way for your 72-hour assessment." Rachel blinked away sleep, immediately alert. "Have you seen any preliminary results?" Michael shook his head. "Not yet, but the night nurse mentioned your temperature dropped to normal for the first time since the new antibiotics started. That's encouraging." Before Rachel could respond, the door opened to admit Dr. Martinez, now in fresh clothes and looking remarkably rested for someone who had been awake most of the night. He was accompanied by two other physicians Rachel recognized from the infectious disease consulting team. "Good morning, Ms. Harrison," he greeted her formally, their late-night conversation seemingly a world away in the bright hospital daylight. "We're here to evaluate your response to the antibiotic regimen and make decisions about next steps." The examination that followed was thorough and tense, with the doctors conferring in low voices as they inspected her wounds, reviewed lab results, and assessed her overall condition. Rachel watched their faces for clues, but their professional masks revealed nothing until Dr. Martinez finally straightened and addressed her directly. "The infection is responding to treatment," he announced, the relief in his voice mirroring what Rachel felt flood through her entire body. "The cultures show significantly reduced bacterial load, and the inflammatory markers in your blood work are trending downward consistently. We'll continue the current antibiotic protocol, but I don't believe additional surgical debridement will be necessary at this time." Michael's hand found Rachel's, squeezing tightly as tears of relief welled in both their eyes. "So no amputation?" Rachel asked, needing to hear the words spoken clearly. "Barring any unexpected setbacks or new complications, no," Dr. Martinez replied, his professional demeanor softening slightly. "You're not completely out of danger yet, Rachel, but you've taken a significant step in the right direction." After the medical team departed, Michael collapsed into the visitor's chair, his eyes bright with unshed tears of relief and exhaustion. "Oh my God, Mom, I was so scared." "Me too," Rachel admitted, her own relief making her voice unsteady. "More than I've ever been in my life." They sat in companionable silence for several minutes, both processing the emotional weight of the past 72 hours and the reprieve they had just been granted. Finally, Michael spoke again, his voice hesitant with nervous excitement. "There's something I need to tell you, something I've been waiting to share until we knew you were going to be okay." Rachel studied her son's face, noting a mixture of nervousness and joy that she hadn't seen since he was a child with a secret too big to contain. "What is it?" "I'm engaged," he said, the words rushing out in a breath. "To Sarah, my study partner from organic chemistry. We've been together for almost 2 years, but we wanted to wait until after graduation to make it official. I was going to tell you when I came home for Christmas, but then all this happened." "You're engaged," Rachel repeated, the news momentarily displacing all thoughts of infection and recovery. "I'm going to have a daughter-in-law." Michael nodded, a smile breaking through his anxiety. "She's amazing, Mom. She's going into pediatric oncology, and she's been so worried about you. She wanted to fly out here, but I told her to wait until you were feeling better." "I want to meet her," Rachel said immediately. "As soon as I'm well enough tell me about her everything." As Michael shared stories about Sarah, about their relationship and their plans for the future, Rachel felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Genuine excitement about what lay ahead. Not just the relief of surviving her medical crisis, but anticipation for the life that would unfold after recovery. For the first time since her diagnosis, Rachel began to believe that her most meaningful chapters might still be waiting to be written. Thank you for spending this time with Brad Arrows. We hope the stories whispered through the rain carried you far into your imagination or your dreams. If you're still awake, let us know how you liked the journey. Until next time, stay safe, sleep well, and let the darkness comfort you.